He just wants to hear it run one more time. Darnell Cruz said those 8 words standing in the middle of Marcus Webb's shop holding a helmet that hadn't been touched in 15 years, and every man in that building felt something shift in his chest. Not one of them moved. Not one of them spoke. Because everyone in that room understood this wasn't a repair request anymore. This was a dying man's last wish wrapped in 47 years of iron and memory, and the only question left was whether anyone in that shop had enough of both to answer it. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. Marcus Webb had been running his shop for 22 years, and in 22 years, he had seen everything a motorcycle could do to a man. He had seen bikes come in looking like they'd been dragged behind a train. He had seen engines so seized they needed cutting torches just to open. He had pulled machines out of rivers, out of barn fires, out of garages that hadn't been opened since the Reagan administration. He thought he had developed a working immunity to surprise. Then Darnell Cruz rolled in a 1977 Harley-Davidson shovelhead, and Marcus Webb felt something he hadn't felt standing in front of a motorcycle in a very long time. He felt afraid. Not afraid of the bike, afraid of what it meant. Afraid of the weight behind it. Afraid of the 8 words Darnell had said before he even took his hands off the handlebars. He just wants to hear it run one more time. Darnell was 29 years old, built wide through the shoulders with the kind of face that had learned to control itself early in life. He wasn't a man who cried in front of people. You could see that in him the moment he walked through the door. But his jaw was working in a way that had nothing to do with anything he was about to say. And his eyes had that particular quality Marcus had seen in people who were carrying grief they hadn't fully admitted to themselves yet. "Who's he?" Marcus asked, even though some part of him already understood this wasn't a casual story. Darnell didn't answer right away. He looked at the bike. He looked at it the way people look at something they love and can't save that specific kind of looking that's really just prolonged goodbye. "My uncle," Darnell said. "Raymond Cruz. He rode with the Hells Angels Raleigh chapter for 19 years. This bike was his. He called her Magdalena." He stopped. His jaw worked again. "He's at St. Mary's right now, room 412. The doctors say." He stopped again, started over. "They're not giving him much time. Maybe 2 weeks, maybe less." Marcus looked at the shovelhead. He walked around it slowly. He didn't touch it yet. He just looked. The machine was magnificent in its destruction. Chrome that had once been mirror bright had gone the color of old pewter, oxidized and clouded. The leather seat had cracked and curled at the edges like dried bark. The tires had gone flat so long ago that the rubber had begun to separate from the rims in places not just deflated, but structurally compromised. The carburetor wore a crust of corrosion so thick it looked geological, like something that had grown there rather than settled. The engine cases showed a crack along the lower left that Marcus's trained eye caught immediately, not a surface scratch, not cosmetic damage, but a structural fracture that ran deep and threatened everything around it. He crouched down and looked at the primary chain. He stood back up. He put his hands in his pockets. "How many shops has this been to?" Marcus asked. Darnell exhaled. 4, 9 total attempts between them. The last guy, a shovelhead specialist out of Durham guy, who's been working these engines for 30 years, he told me to stop. He said the engine case crack alone made the bike unrestorable. Said even if I found someone willing to try, the liability wasn't worth it. He looked at Marcus directly. "He told me to let it go." "But you didn't." "My uncle built his whole life around this bike." Darnell's voice didn't waver exactly, but it thickened around the edges. "He rode it to his first chapter run. He rode it when his daughter was born. He rode it to his best friend's funeral. When his wife left, this bike was what he kept." He paused. "He doesn't have much left in that hospital bed, but he remembers every sound this engine ever made. He talks about it like it's a person, like she's waiting for him somewhere." He looked at the machine. "I just want him to hear it one more time before..." He stopped. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Marcus stood in the middle of his shop for a long moment. Around him, the ordinary sounds of the place continued: an air compressor, cycling the radio in the back, playing something low and indistinct, the distant clang of a socket wrench. Normal sounds, working sounds, the sounds of a shop where problems got solved and engines got fixed. He looked at the shovel head and understood with the specific clarity of a man who had been doing this work long enough to know the difference that this was not a normal problem. "Leave it," Marcus said. Darnell blinked. "What?" "Leave the bike. Leave me your number. I'm not promising you anything except that my guys will look at it." Marcus met his eyes. "I'm not going to tell you it's possible, and I'm not going to tell you it isn't. I'm going to tell you we'll look at it and we'll tell you the truth." Darnell nodded. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He held it out to Marcus. Marcus took it. It was a photograph, old, printed on the kind of paper that cameras used to use, with that slightly waxy surface and the colors that had shifted over the decades toward yellow and orange. In the photograph, a younger man, maybe 30, built lean and hard, with dark hair and a full dark beard, sat on the shovel head in front of what looked like a chapter meeting point. He was laughing at something outside the frame. His cut showed clearly. His hand rested on the tank with the casual ease of a man touching something that belonged to him as completely as his own name. "That's him," Darnell said. "That's my Uncle Raymond, 1991. Marcus looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then he looked at the bike. Then he looked back at the photograph. "I'll call you," he said. Joey Reyes was 26 years old and the best diagnostic mind Marcus had on his team. Give the kid a modern bike with an electronic fault, and he would have the code read, the fault tree mapped, and the correction plan written before most techs had found the right cable. He was fast, methodical, and precise in the way that came from genuine intelligence rather than from habit. Marcus had watched Joey diagnose problems that stumped men twice his age. He watched Joey approach the shovelhead the way a man approaches a locked door he expects to be able to open. Within 90 minutes, that confidence began to erode. "There's no OBD port," Joey said, which wasn't a surprise to anyone who knew the bike's age, but his tone suggested he was saying it more to himself than to Marcus. "Obviously, it's a 77. He crouched down and looked at the carburetor. "This is a Bendix carb, right? Or a Tillotson?" He stood up. "I'm going to need to look up the spec sheets because I've never actually worked a shovelhead system by hand." "That's fine," Marcus said. "Take your time." That was at 9 in the morning. By noon, Joey was sitting on a stool with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped between them, staring at the shovelhead with an expression Marcus had never seen on his face before. "It doesn't respond to anything I know," Joey said. "I can tell the carburetor is seized completely locked, no movement at all on the fuel needle. The float bowl is probably varnished solid on the inside from old fuel. But the way this system is configured," he shook his head. "The fuel line's the vacuum routing, the way it's all interconnected. It doesn't follow any logic I've worked with before. It's like reading a sentence in a language I kind of understand, but not well enough." "What about the ignition?" Marcus asked. "Corroded. Points ignition system, breaker points, condenser, the whole mechanical setup. I know the theory, but I've never actually set timing by hand with a timing light and a set of feeler gauges on a running engine. Every ignition system I've worked on uses electronic triggering." He paused. "And the engine isn't running, so I can't time it until it runs. And I can't run it until it's timed, and the carburetor is freed and the oil system is verified, and—" He stopped. "And what?" Marcus said. "And there's a crack in the lower engine case that I genuinely don't know what to do about," Joey said. He said it quietly without drama, which somehow made it worse. "It's not a hairline crack. It's a propagated fracture. If that engine produces any significant pressure and that crack gives way—" He looked at Marcus. "I don't know how to assess the risk on that because I've never seen a case failure in progress. I don't know if it would leak or if it would let go all at once." Marcus nodded slowly. He had been afraid of exactly this. "Keep working," he said. "Document everything you find." Terrence Okafor was 44 years old and had been working engines since he was 17. He was old school in the best possible way he could hear a valve train problem through a running engine, the way some people can pick out a single instrument in a full orchestra. Marcus trusted Terrence's hands the way he trusted his own. Terrence took over when Joey's approach hit its wall. He worked the shovelhead for 3 hours without speaking. He pulled the carburetor, a process that required 40 minutes of patience because the mounting screws had corroded into the intake manifold, and he had to work them loose by hand with penetrating oil and careful incremental pressure. Because if he snapped them, he would create a problem worse than the one he was solving. He laid the carburetor on his bench and took it apart. When he had it open, he called Marcus over. Marcus looked inside. The interior of the float bowl was coated in a layer of varnish so thick and so completely solidified that it had essentially become part of the metal. 15 years of fuel slowly evaporating and oxidizing had deposited that residue in ring after ring like geological strata. The fuel needle was completely immobile, fused in place by the same process. "This is going to take time," Terrence said. "How much time?" "Doing it right, a full rebuild. Clean every passage by hand, replace the needle and seat, check the float for fuel intrusion. If the float has absorbed fuel, it'll ride too heavy and flood the engine." He set down the carburetor body. "And that's just the carburetor. I checked the oil pump drive." He stopped. Marcus waited. "The oil pump gear teeth are worn down past the service limit," Terrence said. "Not slightly. Past. If this engine runs in its current state, it won't get adequate oil to the top end." He looked at Marcus steadily. Within maybe 15 minutes of sustained running, the rocker arms start starving. Once the rocker sees, you're looking at catastrophic valve train failure. Bent push rods, damaged heads, possibly a dropped valve. "Okay," Marcus said. "That's not the end of it." Terrence picked up his notepad. He'd been writing things down which Marcus noticed meant Terrence was worried enough about the list to want a physical record. "The primary chain has stretched to a point where it's going to jump the sprocket under load. If it jumps while the engine is running, it could damage the primary case, or worse." Terrence set the notepad down. He looked at the motorcycle. "Marcus, I've worked old iron my whole career. I love it. But this isn't a restoration. He searched for the word. "This is a full mechanical resurrection. Parts of this engine haven't moved in 15 years. Metal that's been static that long doesn't just start up again. It has to be coaxed back. Every component has to be assessed individually because some of them are going to be right on the edge of tolerance, and you won't know which ones until you're in the middle of it." "Can you do it?" Marcus asked. Terrence was quiet for a moment. He was an honest man, which meant he didn't answer that question quickly. "I can do my part of it," he said finally. "I can rebuild that carburetor. I can replace the primary chain. I can work on the oil pump if we can source or fabricate the gear. But the ignition timing, that's a points system, and I haven't set timing on a points system in 20 years. And that engine case crack," he shook his head. "I'm not a welder, and I don't know if that fracture can even be welded without causing thermal distortion to the surrounding case material. That needs someone who knows cast aluminum repair specifically." "Iron," Marcus said. "What? The shovel head case is iron, not aluminum." Terrence stared at him. "Then it's even more complicated. Cast iron welding is a whole different skill set. You need a specific rod, preheating, controlled cooling. If you don't do it exactly right, you can cause more cracking than you started with." He paused. "I don't know anyone who does that work. Not on motorcycle cases. Not anymore." Marcus went into his office and closed the door. He sat behind his desk and looked at the photograph of Raymond Cruz that Darnell had left with him. The man in the photograph was laughing. Whatever had made him laugh in that moment in 1991 was still in his face, still alive in his eyes, frozen there by the camera, and 34 years of time passing without returning. Marcus picked up his phone. He scrolled through contacts he hadn't touched in years. He was looking for something. He wasn't sure he still had a number for a man he hadn't spoken to in almost a decade. He found it. He stared at it. Derek Paulson was 23 and had been with the shop for 8 months. He was talented in the unfocused way of someone who hadn't yet found the thing that was going to define him, good at a lot of things without being exceptional at any one of them. He worked hard and took direction well, and Marcus liked him for both qualities. Derek had been listening to Joey's report and Terrence's assessment without saying much. When Marcus came back out of his office, Derek was standing in front of the shovel head with his hands in his pockets. "I want to try something," Derek said. What Marcus said. "I want to try to free the rear cylinder's rocker box cover, just to see what's inside. Get a sense of whether the top end is viable." He looked at Marcus. "I've been watching videos. There are guys who've done shovelhead top end rebuilds on YouTube. I know how it's supposed to come apart." Marcus looked at him. 23 years old, 8 months in, watching YouTube videos. "Derek," he said carefully, "what do you know about shovelhead rocker box design?" Derek's confidence, which had been trying to hold its shape, softened slightly. "I know the basics. The rocker arms ride on a common shaft. There are 2 inspection covers per cylinder. And if the rocker arm shaft has galled from oil starvation, then it could be fused to the case and you'd need to... He stopped. He started again. You'd need to be careful taking it apart so you don't... So you don't what? Derek didn't answer immediately. So you don't snap the shaft or damage the rocker arm towers, he said finally quietly. And if you snap the shaft on a 77 shovelhead, Marcus said, you'd need to find a replacement. Derek paused. Which might not be available. Which might not be available, Marcus confirmed. And if you damage the rocker arm towers? Derek said nothing. Machine work, Marcus said. Specialized machine work on a cast iron engine case that already has a structural fracture in it, performed by someone with the specific knowledge and equipment to do it without causing thermal cracking. He held Derek's eyes. You understand what I'm saying? Yeah, Derek said quietly. I understand. I'm not telling you not to learn, Marcus said. I'm telling you that on this job, we don't experiment. Every move on this machine has to be something we're certain of, because the margin for error is already gone. He looked at the bike. It was probably gone before it got here. He went back to his office. He picked up his phone again. He dialed the number. It rang 4 times. Then a voice answered, graveled and slow. The voice of a man who had stopped hurrying through things a long time ago. Yeah. Walter, Marcus said. It's Marcus Webb. We worked together in 1415. You consulted on the Buell restoration and then the hardtail build for the guy in Cary. A pause. I remember you, Walter Boyd said. I've got a situation, Marcus said. A 1977 shovelhead. 47 years old, hasn't run in 15. 4 shops have already refused it. My team is telling me it's not possible. Silence. Then Walter said, what's the reason it needs to run? Marcus told him about Raymond Cruz. He told him about St. Mary's. He told him what Darnell had said, those 8 words, the photograph, the 19 years of chapter, writing, and the man in the picture who was still laughing at something outside the frame. Walter was quiet for a long time. I'm 68 years old, he said finally. I walk with a cane. I know, Marcus said. My hands aren't what they were. I know that too. Another pause. I'll be there tomorrow morning, Walter said. 8 o'clock. Marcus let out a breath he'd been holding for most of the afternoon. Thank you, Walter. Don't thank me, Walter said. I haven't done anything yet. And he hung up. Darnell Cruz called that evening at 7:15. Marcus answered. My uncle asked about the bike today, Darnell said. His voice was careful, controlled the same way it had been in the shop. He was having a better afternoon. The nurse said he was more alert than he'd been in a week. He asked me if I'd found someone. A pause. I didn't want to tell him anything that might not be true, but I also didn't want to tell him we'd given up. You didn't give up, Marcus said, and we haven't. Do you think it's possible? Darnell asked. Honestly. Marcus looked out his office window. The shop floor was empty, now tools put away, the shovel heads sitting alone under the overhead lights in the silence of the closed building. I think there's a man coming tomorrow morning who has a better chance of knowing than anyone I've ever met, Marcus said. I think that's the honest answer. Darnell was quiet for a moment. Okay, he said. Go be with your uncle tonight, Marcus said. We'll call you when we know something. After he hung up, Marcus sat in his empty office for a while longer. He was thinking about something Terrence had said. Not the technical diagnosis, he'd heard that clearly enough. He was thinking about the phrase Terrence had used almost accidentally, the phrase that kept coming back. A full mechanical resurrection. He looked at the shovel head through the window. He'd been doing this work his whole adult life, and he knew that machines weren't people. He knew that sentiment didn't fix seized carburetors, and that emotion couldn't weld fractured engine cases. He knew all of that. But he also knew because 22 years had taught him that some machines carried weight that didn't have anything to do with their components. Some machines had absorbed something from the people who'd ridden them and loved them and needed them, something that wasn't oil or heat or vibration, but was real nonetheless. He'd felt it before on other bikes and other desperate situations. He felt it now. And tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, a 68-year-old man with a cane and worn hands and 45 years of knowledge was going to walk through his door. That was all Marcus had. But standing in the quiet of his empty shop, looking at the ruined, beautiful, impossible machine under the lights, he found that it felt like enough to keep going. Just enough. for one more day. Walter Boyd arrived at 7:58. Marcus knew this because he was already standing at the shop door when the old truck pulled into the lot and he checked his watch without thinking about it. The way you do when someone has told you 8 o'clock and you've been awake since 5 wondering if they'll actually come. The truck was a 1989 Ford F-150 dark blue, the kind of vehicle that had been maintained rather than replaced, kept alive by attention rather than by money. Walter climbed down from it slowly, one hand on the door frame, the other on the cane he'd mentioned on the phone. He was a tall man, or had been. Age had compressed him slightly, the way it does, settling the shoulders and rounding the upper back by degrees, so gradual the person themselves never quite notices. His hair was white and cut short. His face had the particular quality of a man who had spent decades outdoors and in shop environments, weathered and creased but not broken down. His eyes, when he turned and looked at Marcus, were sharp in a way that had nothing to do with youth. He wore work pants, a flannel shirt rolled to the elbows, and a canvas jacket. No logos, no statement. He looked exactly like what he was, a man who had spent his life doing a specific thing and had no interest in announcing that fact to anyone. He walked toward Marcus. His gait had the slight, irregular rhythm of someone managing real pain without dramatizing it, the cane taking weight on every other step in a way that looked practiced, integrated, unremarkable. "Marcus," he said. "Walter, thanks for coming." "Show me the bike," Walter said. No pleasantries, no warming up. Marcus had forgotten that about him, the way Walter Boyd moved directly to the thing that mattered, as if small talk was a resource he'd decided long ago not to spend. Marcus led him inside. The shop was already active. Joey had come in early, and Terrence was at his bench with the carburetor components spread in precise order on a clean shop rag. Derek was near the back, pretending to organize a tool cabinet, which meant he was watching. Marcus didn't call him out on it. The kid had earned the right to watch. Walter walked to the shovel head and stopped. He stood there. He didn't crouch immediately. He didn't reach for anything. He just looked at the machine from where he was standing, and Marcus, watching him, had the strange and specific sensation of watching someone read a book, not scanning, not skimming, but actually reading, taking in information at a pace determined by the text rather than by the reader's impatience. Nobody spoke. Joey and Terrence, who had been making the quiet sounds of men at work, had both stopped without discussing it. The shop had gone the particular kind of silent that happens when everyone in a room simultaneously understands that something significant is occurring. Walter walked around the bike once slowly, the cane marking time against the concrete. He crouched on the right side, a process that took him a moment and clearly cost him something, and looked at the lower engine case. He reached out and put 2 fingers against the fracture, not pressing, just touching, tracing the line of it the way a doctor palpates a wound to understand its depth. He stood back up. He moved to the left side. He put his hand on the top of the engine and held it there for a moment, palm flat against the metal, eyes closed. Joey, standing 15 feet away, looked at Marcus with an expression that asked a silent question. Marcus gave him a look that said, "Wait." Walter opened his eyes. He looked at the carburetor on Terrence's bench. He walked over and picked up the float bowl, turned it in his hands, looked inside it, set it down. He picked up the fuel needle and examined its tip. "Needle seat," he said to Terrence. "Varnish solid," Terrence said. "I was going to use carb cleaner and a brass brush." "Don't," Walter said. "Carb cleaner will soften the varnish, but it'll also attack the Vuitton if there's any left in the seat. You want lacquer thinner, diluted 50-50, applied with a cotton swab. Work it in passes, not saturation. Give it 20 minutes between passes." He set the needle down. "How many passes did you plan on doing?" Terrence paused. "I was going to soak it. If you soak it, you'll swell the seat material and it won't seal right when it dries. You'll have a carb that looks clean and runs rich." He looked at Terrence without any heat in it, purely informational. 20-minute passes, 4 of them. Then flush with fresh fuel and blow the passages with low-pressure air. Not high-pressure low. High pressure on these old brass passages will deform them. Terrence picked up his notepad and wrote this down. Walter turned back to the motorcycle. He looked at Joey. "You're the diagnostics man," he said. "Yes, sir," Joey said. "What did your diagnostics tell you?" Joey understood from the way the question was asked that this was not a test designed to embarrass him. It was a genuine request for information. "They told me nothing," he said. "There's nothing to interface with. The whole system is pre-electronic. I can read symptoms, but I don't have a framework for interpreting them on this platform. Walter nodded. That's honest, he said. Good. He looked back at the bike. The ignition is a point system. Breaker points, condenser mechanical, advance. The advance mechanism is probably frozen. These bikes sat long enough that the advance weights gum up and stick in the full retard position. If you try to start it with a frozen advance, you'll get kickback. Hard kickback. Enough to break an ankle. Joey made a quiet sound that wasn't quite a word. The points gap needs to be set at 22 thousandths, Walter continued. The condenser is likely failed. They don't age well in storage. The dielectric breaks down. You'll need a new one. Timing set at 35 degrees, total advance. He paused. You have a timing light. Yes, Marcus said. You have a dial indicator. Marcus looked at Terrence. Terrence said, I have one. Don't know if it'll fit this application. It won't, Walter said. Not stock. We'll need to fabricate an adapter. He said this without sighing, without expressing frustration. He said it the way a man states a fact that is inconvenient, but not surprising, the way someone with experience says things that someone without it would call setbacks. Marcus was watching him carefully. He was watching the way Walter moved through problems, not around them, not away from them, but straight through them, identifying the obstacle and immediately converting it into a task. There was no drama in it. There was no performance. It was just how the man thought. Walter, Marcus said, the engine case. Walter turned to look at him. Terrence says it can't be welded without causing more damage. Terrence is right, Walter said. The shop went quiet again. Then how? Joey started. It can't be welded cold, Walter said. And it can't be welded by someone who doesn't know cast iron repair. But it can be repaired. He looked at the fracture. You preheat the surrounding area. Specific temperature, you need a heat gun and a pyrometer, not a torch, because torch heat is uncontrolled and will cause thermal shock. You bring the material up to around 400 degrees Fahrenheit across a 6-inch radius around the fracture. Then you weld with a nickel rod, not mild steel nickel, and you peen the weld as it cools to relieve stress. He paused. Then you let it cool at room temperature. No water, no fans, no accelerating the cooling. Minimum 2 hours. Who does that work? Marcus asked. Someone who's done it before, Walter said. He looked at Terrence. Have you ever welded cast iron? Terrence considered this carefully. I've welded cast iron on agricultural equipment, a tractor manifold, once. What rod did you use? Nickel 99, Terrence said. Walter looked at him for a moment. Then something in his face shifted, not quite a smile, but the preparation for one. That's the right answer, he said. Most guys would have said mild steel or flux core, and I'd have told you to step away from the bike. He held Terrence's eyes. You can do this repair. I'll walk you through the temperature control, but it needs to happen after we know the engine is viable, because if we find more internal damage that requires opening the case, we do the weld last. Terrence nodded slowly. There was something in his face that Marcus hadn't seen there in a long time, a kind of focused intensity that wasn't anxiety, but was its direct neighbor. All right, Marcus said. Where do we start? We start with what we can't replace, Walter said. The engine internals. He looked at Marcus. Do you have a set of shovelhead service specs? Not a general manual, the factory specifications document. Marcus pulled out his phone. Put that away, Walter said, not unkindly. You won't find what I need on a website. The factory clearances for the 77 shovelhead bottom end were revised twice, once in March of 77 and again in October. The casting date on this engine is... He leaned down and looked at a number stamped into the case. He straightened up. June of 77, so it falls under the March revision. The main bearing clearance is different from the original spec by 0.5 thousandth. 0.5 thousandth sounds like nothing. But if you use the wrong spec to assess bearing wear, you'll tell me the bearings are good when they're at the edge of failure. He paused. I have the spec sheet in my truck. I brought it because I knew I'd need it. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Derek from the back of the shop said quietly, he brought the spec sheet. It wasn't meant to be heard. But it was. Walter glanced in Derek's direction, and there was something in that glance that wasn't irritation, more like recognition. He'd been that young man once, the one watching from the edge of the room and trying to absorb everything. Come here, Walter said to Derek. Derek came forward. You're going to be my hands for the parts I can't reach anymore, Walter said. He held up his right hand. The knuckles were enlarged, the fingers slightly bent from what was clearly significant arthritis. My left hand is fine for most purposes. My right hand loses fine motor control under sustained pressure. So when I need two hands on something that requires precision, you're going to be the second hand. Derek stared at him. He was 23 years old, and Walter had just told him he was going to be part of working a 1977 shovelhead back from the dead. He looked like a man who had just been handed something that was both terrifying and the most important thing he'd ever been offered. Yes, sir, Derek said. Don't call me sir, Walter said. Call me Walter. He turned back to the motorcycle. Let's open the top end. The top end came apart over the course of 4 hours. Not 4 hours of steady progress. 4 hours of careful, patient, occasionally agonizing work, in which every step revealed information that had to be assessed before the next step could be taken. Walter directed from a stool he'd had Marcus bring out, sitting beside the bike, and talking Derek through each procedure in a low, even voice that never rose in urgency and never fell below absolute clarity. He was a teacher who had taught so many times that the instruction had become part of his breath. He didn't have to think about how to explain something. It simply came out in the right order, at the right depth, without excess. The rocker box covers came off first. Walter told Derek exactly how much torque to apply to the cover bolts. Not a number from a spec sheet, but a feel described in language. A half turn, pass snug, stop the moment you feel the casting flex, because these old covers had been sitting and the gasket material had welded itself to both surfaces, and if you pulled the cover too hard without working it free, you'd crack a fin. Derek worked it free. The rocker arms appeared. Walter leaned forward on his stool and looked at them without speaking for almost a full minute. Then he said, Marcus, come look at this. Marcus crouched beside him. Left rocker arm, Walter said. Exhaust side. You see that discoloration? Marcus looked. The metal showed a pattern of color that was different from the general patina of age, a darker, more irregular staining that ran across the rocker's contact surface. Heat damage, Marcus said. Oil starvation, Walter said. This rocker ran dry for some period before the bike was parked. The heat damage is from friction, not from combustion, which means he stopped. The oil pump was failing before it was stored, Marcus finished. Or the oil lines were partially blocked. But yes, this rocker has been running on the edge for a while. He paused. The contact surface is worn past the point where it can be restored by polishing. We need a new rocker arm. The silence that followed had a specific quality to it. Walter, Marcus said carefully, new 1977 shovelhead rocker arms aren't. I know what they aren't, Walter said. I know what's available and what isn't. New old stock parts for a 77 shovelhead exhaust rocker in this configuration haven't been on a shelf anywhere since probably 1994. He reached into the canvas bag he'd brought from his truck and produced a piece of round stock steel approximately 4 inches long and 1 inch in diameter. He set it on the workbench beside the bike, which is why I brought this. Joey, who had been watching from a respectful distance, said, You're going to machine a rocker arm from bar stock. I'm going to have Terrence machine a rocker arm from bar stock, Walter said, while I work on the lower end. He looked at Terrence. Do you have a lathe? Yes, Terrence said. Good. I need the contact surface radius to match the original exactly. I'll give you the measurement. He picked up the damaged rocker arm and handed it to Terrence. Use this as your reference for geometry. The material I brought is 4140 chromoly. It's actually harder than the original material, which is fine. Harder is better for a wear surface. He paused. The original was cast iron. 4140 will machine differently. You need slower speed, more cutting fluid, and lighter cuts, Terrence said. Walter looked at him. Yes, lighter cuts. The preparation for a smile again. You've machined 4140 before. Once or twice, Terrence said. He was already picking up the piece of round stock, turning it in his hands, looking at it the way a craftsman looks at raw material and begins to see what's inside it. At noon, Darnell called. Marcus stepped away from the shop floor to take it. How is he today? Marcus asked, because he'd learned enough from Darnell's voice over the last 24 hours to know that the answer to that question determined everything else. He had a bad night, Darnell said. His voice had changed. The careful control was still there, but it was working harder now, carrying more weight. His blood pressure dropped. They adjusted his medication. This morning he was lucid, but he was tired in a way that scared me. A pause. He asked about the bike again. Marcus pressed his free hand flat against the wall of his office and looked at the floor. He asked if she was going to run again, Darnell said. I didn't know what to tell him. Tell him we're working on it, Marcus said. Tell him there are people here who know what they're doing. Is that true? Darnell asked. It wasn't an accusation. It was a man with nothing left to lose asking the one question that mattered. Yes, Marcus said. It's true. And he meant it completely, which was something he hadn't been able to say 24 hours ago. After he hung up, he went back onto the shop floor and told Walter about the call. He wasn't sure why he told him Walter hadn't asked, and the information had no technical bearing on the work. But he told him anyway. Walter listened without stopping what he was doing, which was examining the primary chain under a magnifying glass. When Marcus finished, Walter set down the magnifying glass and sat quietly for a moment. My father had a 64 panhead, Walter said. He rode it for 30 years. When he was in the hospital, End Stage couldn't get out of bed. My brother and I brought the bike to the parking lot below his window and started it. We had to get permission from the hospital. Took us 3 days of asking. He paused. When he heard it running, he cried. He was not a man who cried. He cried. He picked up the magnifying glass again and went back to the chain. This chain is beyond salvage, he said, as if the other thing hadn't been said. We need a replacement. Do you have chain stock? I have standard roller chain, Marcus said, but the pitch, 80 pitch, 5/8 inch. I know what you carry. He wrote something on a small notepad he kept in his shirt pocket. Call Biker's Choice in Charlotte. They stock shovel-head primary chain. They won't have it on the shelf. You'll need to ask them to check the warehouse. He tore the page off the notepad and handed it to Marcus. That's the part number. Tell them you need it before end of business today. Offer to pay their premium delivery rate. Marcus looked at the part number. This is a 30-year-old part. Some things don't change, Walter said. Marcus made the call. The man at Biker's Choice checked. He checked again. He put Marcus on hold for 6 minutes that felt considerably longer. Then he came back and said they had 2 of them in the warehouse old stock and they could have 1 there by 4:30 if Marcus paid the delivery fee. Marcus paid the delivery fee without hesitating. When he came back and told Walter, the old man simply nodded as if he'd expected nothing else, which Marcus was beginning to understand was more or less how Walter Boyd operated. He expected that if you approached a problem with the right knowledge and the right patience, solutions appeared. Not easily, not without cost, but they appeared. The first real crisis of the day came at 2:15 in the afternoon. Terrence had finished the machined rocker. Arm had done it in a piece of work that Marcus would have been proud of under any circumstances, the contact surface true and smooth, the geometry matching the original to within 1,000th of an inch, confirmed with the dial indicator. Walter had helped him set up. Derek had helped fit it back into the rocker box, and they'd been running through the valve train verification when Joey, who had been working independently on cleaning the ignition components, said, Walter, I need you to look at something. His voice was controlled in the particular way of a man who has found something he doesn't want to have found. Walter got up from his stool and walked to where Joey was working. Joey showed him the condenser. Or rather, Joey showed him what was left of the condenser. The component had been corroded through at its crimp connection in a way that wasn't visible from the outside. The outer case looked serviceable, corroded but intact, and Joey had assumed it was rebuildable. But when he'd cut it open to check the dielectric, the inner roll of foil and paper had decayed into something that could be described as composting rather than corroding. The internal structure had essentially ceased to exist. I can get a replacement condenser, Joey said. That's not the problem. Walter waited. When I was cleaning the advance mechanism, Joey said, I found this. He held up the mechanical advance assembly. A small spring, barely an inch long, lay separately in his palm. The advance spring is broken, not weakened broken, snapped through cleanly, probably happened during storage from metal fatigue. Walter took the spring and looked at it. What does a broken advance spring mean for the timing? Marcus asked. Walter set the spring down. Without a functioning advance spring, the mechanical advance weights have nothing to control their travel. The ignition advance becomes either fixed at full advance or fixed at full retard, depending on how the weights are sitting. He paused. In this case, given that Terrence found the advance weights frozen, they're almost certainly stuck in full retard, which means even if we set the timing correctly at the points, the engine will run heavily retarded at higher RPM. It'll start probably, but it'll run hot, it'll run sluggish, and sustained operation will overheat the engine. Can we replace the spring? Marcus said. If we can find one, Joey said. But this is a specific application, it's not a universal part. It's a 1977 Harley-Davidson mechanical advanced spring. The shop was quiet. Walter said, "How long is your tension spring stock?" Marcus frowned. "My what?" "Your assortment of small tension springs. Hardware springs. Every shop has a drawer of them." Marcus went to his hardware cabinet and pulled out a shallow drawer full of small springs in various configurations. Tension springs, compression springs, torsion, springs accumulated over years from parts packages and jobs where the original had to be replaced with something approximate. Walter went through the drawer. His fingers moved with that careful, deliberate quality that Marcus was coming to recognize as his baseline, not slow exactly, but measured each movement intentional. He found a spring. He held it next to the original. "The rate is close," he said, "but not identical. The free length is about 15% longer than the original, which means it'll produce more restoring force on the advance weights. The advance curve will come in slightly later, and the total advance will be marginally less." He set both springs side by side. "It's not correct, but correct isn't available today." "Will it work?" Marcus said. Walter looked at him. "In the context of what we're asking this engine to do, yes, it will work." He held up the replacement spring. "I want it understood that this is a compromise. This engine in this configuration is not being restored to factory specification. It's being restored to functional." He looked around at all of them. "There's a difference." "We understand," Marcus said. "Good." Walter handed the spring to Joey. "Fit it. Clean the advanced mechanism thoroughly before you reassemble. If those weights don't move freely, the spring won't matter." He paused. "And Joey?" "Yeah," Joey said. "You're doing well," Walter said. It was simple and direct and contained no excess warmth, just an honest assessment delivered without ceremony. But Joey, who was 26 years old and had spent the last 2 days having his competence quietly dismantled by the complexity of this machine, visibly reacted. His shoulders shifted. Something in his posture changed. "Thank you," Joey said. Walter was already back at the motorcycle. The primary chain arrived at 4:22. Marcus signed for it, brought it in, handed it to Walter, who inspected it for manufacturing defects, and then handed it to Derek with a detailed explanation of how to fit it correctly, including the critical point about master link orientation that Marcus knew from experience was the thing most people got wrong on primary chain installations. Derek fit it correctly on the first try. Walter said good and moved on. By 5:30, the carburetor had been through its fourth pass of diluted lacquer thinner, and Terrence was flushing the internal passages with fresh fuel from a squeeze bottle. Walter stood at his elbow and directed his voice low and patient. "Slower," Walter said. "You're pushing too hard. Let the fuel flow at its own rate through the emulsion tube passage. If you push it, you'll dislodge the emulsion tube jets, and you won't know it happened until the engine runs rich and you have to pull the carb again." Terrence slowed. "There," Walter said. You feel the difference. The fuel is flowing under its own gravity now." "Yeah," Terrence said quietly. "I feel it. That passage is clear. Move to the main jet bore." The work continued. At 6, Marcus called for food. He drove to the sandwich place 2 blocks away and bought enough for everyone. He set it on the workbench and nobody stopped working to eat it. They ate when they could, standing one hand on a tool and one hand on a sandwich, because the work had developed a momentum of its own, a gathering internal pressure that nobody wanted to break. Walter ate half a sandwich, set it down, and went back to the motorcycle. Marcus watched him and thought about the story Walter had told about his father and the 1964 Panhead and the hospital parking lot. He thought about the 3 days of asking for permission. He thought about what it meant to wait 3 days for something that mattered that much, and what it meant to finally hear the sound you've been waiting for. He thought about Raymond Cruz in room 412 of St. Mary's, and whether the man was sleeping or awake right now, and whether he was dreaming about the bike.
Tosamita.
At 7:45 that evening, with the shop lights fully on against the dark outside, Walter assembled the last component of the carburetor, slid it back onto the intake manifold, and tightened the mounting screws to the precise torque he'd specified. Not with a torque wrench, because the torque wrench they had didn't go low enough, but by feel, which in Walter's case meant by 45 years of accumulated sensation living in his left hand. He stood up. He looked at the motorcycle. The engine was fully assembled except for the engine case repair. The carburetor was on. The primary chain was fitted. The valve train was correct. The ignition components were clean gapped and timed to the best of their ability without a running engine to verify against. The machined rocker arms sat where the damaged one had been Terrence's work, indistinguishable from the original by eye. But the fracture in the engine case was still there. Open. Visible. Waiting. "Terrence," Walter said. Terrence came to stand beside him. "Tell me about your weld on the tractor manifold," Walter said. "Tell me everything. How you preheated it, what rod you used, how you controlled the cooling." Terrence told him. He told him in detail the way a man tells a story he's been carrying a long time, a job he'd been proud of but had never had a reason to fully articulate before tonight. Walter listened without interrupting. When Terrence finished, Walter was quiet for a long moment. "You can do this repair," Walter said finally. "You sure about that?" Terrence said. He asked it without false modesty. It was a real question from a real craftsman who understood the consequences of being wrong. "I'm sure about what you've told me," Walter said. "Whether what you told me is the truth is between you and your own hands." He held Terrence's eyes. "Is it?" Terrence breathed out slowly. He looked at the fracture in the engine case. He looked at it the way Marcus had seen him look at problems before, fully, without flinching from what he saw. "Yeah," Terrence said, "it is." "Then we'll do it tomorrow morning," Walter said. "We need to let the engine sit at temperature tonight after running the carburetor cleaner through it, and I need to check one more thing before we close the case." He crouched down beside the engine with more difficulty than before it was late, and his body had been paying the bill for the day's work for the last couple of hours. He put his hand against the engine case, palm flat, eyes closed. Nobody made a sound. When he opened his eyes, something in his expression had changed. It wasn't alarm exactly, but it wasn't ease either. "Walter," Marcus said. Walter stood back up slowly. He looked at Marcus directly. "I found something this morning when I looked at the top end," he said. "I didn't say anything because I wanted to get through the day's work before adding to the weight of it." He paused. "The flex in this case, the way it moved when Terrence ran the engine's primary side, it tells me the fracture may have a secondary branch. Hairline. Not visible from the outside." He looked at the case. "When Terrence does the repair tomorrow, he may open that fracture up and find it's longer than we think. Possibly by an inch. Possibly more." Marcus stared at him. "What does that mean for the repair?" "It means the repair becomes significantly more difficult," Walter said, "and the risk of thermal distortion increases." He paused. "It doesn't mean it can't be done. It means we need to go into tomorrow knowing that we might find a bigger problem than the one we're looking at right now." He looked at Marcus steadily. "I wanted you to know." The shop was very quiet. Joey said from where he was cleaning up his workspace, "Is there anything that would make you stop? Any point where you'd say it can't be done?" Walter turned and looked at him. He considered the question with the same seriousness he brought to every other question in that shop. "Yes," he said. "If the secondary fracture has propagated into the main bearing, or the structural integrity of the case is compromised beyond what a surface weld can address, the case would need to be replaced, and replacement cases for this engine in this specific configuration." He stopped. He didn't finish the sentence because the end of it was obvious, and there was no point in stating it. Marcus looked at the motorcycle. All of it. The carburetor that was clean for the first time in 15 years. The rocker arm that hadn't existed 24 hours ago. The primary chain that had come in a package that smelled like a warehouse in 1992. The ignition system that was as close to correct as anyone could make it without a running engine to verify against. All of it. He thought about Raymond Cruz. He thought about Darnell standing in this shop saying he just wants to hear it run one more time. And he thought about the photograph of a man laughing at something that was outside the frame. And he thought about Walter Boyd's father and a hospital parking lot and 3 days of asking permission and the sound of a panhead engine rising up through an open window. "We go in tomorrow," Marcus said, and we find out what's there. Walter picked up his cane and his canvas bag. 8 o'clock, he said. He walked to the door. He stopped without turning around. The bike is going to fight us, he said. Old machines always fight. It doesn't mean they don't want to run. He paused. It means they've been waiting a long time, and they've forgotten how. He went out into the dark, and the shop held what he'd left in it, the weight of tomorrow, the unfinished fracture, the possibility of everything, the possibility of nothing. And all four men who remained stood with that weight for a long moment before anyone moved. Marcus didn't sleep. He tried. He went home at 9:30, ate something he couldn't remember the taste of, sat on the edge of his bed, and lay down. He stared at the ceiling for 40 minutes. He got up, went to his kitchen, stood at the counter, and thought about the fracture in the engine case with the specific grinding quality of thought that doesn't solve anything but won't stop regardless. He thought about Walter's words. The bike is going to fight us. Old machines always fight. He thought about the secondary fracture that might or might not be there, hidden inside the iron, invisible, until the moment it became a catastrophe. He thought about Terrence's face when Walter had said, "You can do this repair," the way Terrence had received it seriously without the false comfort of someone who wanted to be reassured. He thought about Raymond Cruz in room 412 and whether the man was sleeping and whether in sleep he was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere with more room and less pain. Somewhere with the sound of a shovelhead engine running under him on an open road. At 12:30, he gave up on sleeping, drove back to the shop, let himself in, and stood in front of the motorcycle for an hour. He didn't touch it. He just stood there. He had done this before over the years with machines that mattered. It wasn't mysticism. It was the thing a man does when he's out of analytical options, and he knows the rest of it is going to require something. He can't plan for some combination of skill and luck, and the willingness to keep going past the point where keeping going makes logical sense. He went back home at 2 a.m. and slept for 4 hours. He was back in the shop by 6:15. Terrence arrived at 6:45. He came in without saying much, set his coffee on the bench, and stood in front of the motorcycle for a moment in a way that mirrored what Marcus had been doing the night before. Though Marcus didn't know that, and Terrence didn't know Marcus had been there at midnight. They were both men who processed the heaviness of a thing by returning to it by standing in front of it in the quiet hours and letting it settle into a shape they could carry. "You sleep?" Marcus asked. "Some," Terrence said. "You calm." "Some," Marcus said. They didn't discuss either answer in detail. Derek arrived at 7:10, which was 50 minutes earlier than his scheduled start time. He came through the door moving with a contained energy that was different from his usual pace. Not rushed, but charged the way a person moves when they woke up already thinking about something and have been thinking about it ever since. He nodded at Marcus, and Terrence poured himself coffee and immediately went to the motorcycle to look at the case fracture. He stood there studying it with the dial indicator Marcus had left out the night before, not touching, just measuring it with his eyes. Joey came at 7:30, also early, also quiet. All four of them were in the shop all early. None of them having fully discussed the plan for the morning, all of them simply understanding that today was the day the decision would be made. You either found out the fracture was manageable or you found out it wasn't, and either way, you needed to be there when that happened. Walter arrived at 7:59. He came through the door, looked at all four of them already assembled, and said nothing about it. He set down his canvas bag, took off his jacket, and said, "Has anyone touched the case since last night?" "No," Marcus said. "Good." Walter set his cane against the workbench and crouched beside the lower engine case. He pressed both hands against the iron, his good left hand and his compromised right, and held them there. He was doing something that looked like nothing to someone who didn't understand it, and that Marcus was beginning to understand was a form of conversation. Walter was asking the machine a question with his hands and waiting for the answer. He stayed that way for a long moment. Then he stood. He looked at Terrence. "Get the heat gun and the pyrometer," he said. "We're going to find out what's in there." The preheat took 40 minutes. Walter managed the temperature with a precision that Marcus found almost unnerving to watch, moving the heat gun in careful overlapping passes across a 6-inch radius around the fracture, checking the surface temperature with the pyrometer every 90 seconds, adjusting distance and angle to keep the heat even. He talked through every adjustment, not performing for the audience, but thinking out loud in the way that was simply how he processed work. "Cast iron wants patient heat," he said. You rush this, you create a temperature gradient across the material. The outside gets hot faster than the inside. When that happens, the outer surface tries to expand, while the inner material is still cold and resistant. The stress that creates, he moved the heat gun another quarter inch, is exactly the stress you're trying to relieve. You make the problem worse. Terrence stood at his elbow watching, learning, copying the angle of the heat gun in his mind and filing it. Derek held the pyrometer and it called out temperatures every 90 seconds. 260, Derek said. Good. Keep going. 290. Slow down the passes slightly. We're approaching the target range. 310. Hold it there. Don't go higher until the reading stabilizes. They waited. The temperature on the pyrometer held at 312, dropped to 308, climbed back to 310. It's stabilizing, Derek said. Good. Terrence, pick up the rod. Terrence picked up the nickel welding rod. His hands were steady. Marcus was watching his hands specifically the way you watch a surgeon's hands during something critical, looking for any sign of uncertainty. There was none. Terrence's hands were the hands of a man who understood what he was doing well enough not to be afraid of it. The first pass is a butter pass, Walter said. You're not building the weld. You're introducing the rod material to the base metal and letting them get acquainted. Very low amperage, very slow travel. You're depositing the thinnest possible layer of filler. It looks like almost nothing. That's correct. Terrence nodded. He positioned himself, found his angle. He put the rod to the iron. The weld started. The shop was absolutely silent except for the sound of the process. Joey stood back. Derek held the pyrometer. Marcus stood at the edge, not quite holding his breath, but not far from it. Walter watched Terrence work and said nothing, which meant everything was going correctly. Terrence completed the first pass. Walter examined it with a magnifying glass, moving the glass slowly along the length of the weld bead, checking for porosity, checking for the cold shut appearance that indicated the rod material hadn't fused properly with the base metal. He moved the glass to the very end of the fracture, where the crack tapered toward its terminus. He stopped. He held the magnifying glass steady for a long moment. There it is, he said quietly. Marcus's chest tightened. The secondary fracture, yes. Walter didn't move the glass. It's a branch, about 3/4 of an inch. It runs at approximately 45 degrees off the main fracture line toward the main bearing bore. He paused. It hasn't reached the bore. There's approximately 1/4 inch of sound material between the tip of this branch fracture and the bearing bore wall. The shop held that information in silence for a moment. 1/4 inch, Terrence said. Yes. Is that enough? Marcus asked. Walter set down the magnifying glass. He sat back on his stool. He was quiet for what felt like a long time, but was probably 15 seconds. It depends on the repair, he said. If we weld the branch fracture correctly, if the fusion is complete, and the post-weld stress is properly relieved through peening, yes. 1/4 inch of sound iron between a welded fracture and the bearing bore is sufficient structural margin for the loads this engine will produce. He paused. If the repair is imperfect in any significant way, the residual stress will propagate toward that bore. If it reaches the bore, he stopped. The bearing will lose its seat, Terrence said, and the engine destroys itself from the inside, Walter confirmed. He looked at Terrence. He held the man's eyes for a long moment. You need to decide if you want to continue, right now, because once we extend the weld into that branch fracture, we're committed. The word committed sat in the air. Terrence looked at the fracture. He looked at it the way Marcus had seen him look at things that required the full weight of his judgment completely, without hurrying, with the particular quality of a man who believed that the truth about a thing was accessible if you looked at it honestly enough. I want to continue, Terrence said. Then we continue, Walter said. The second pass took 22 minutes. Walter directed every increment of it, travel speed, rod angle, the precise moment to pause and let the puddle cool slightly before continuing the particular way to approach the branch fracture, where it diverged from the main line, requiring Terrence to change his electrode angle mid-pass without losing the puddle. It was the kind of instruction that required the instructor to hold the full picture in his mind while communicating only the immediate detail, trusting the craftsman to execute each step without needing to understand the whole architecture at once. Terrence executed every step. When the second pass was complete, Walter peened the weld, a series of controlled rhythmic taps with a small peen hammer along the entire length of the repair, relieving the residual stress that welding had introduced into the surrounding material. The sound was quiet and regular, almost meditative. Then he said, "Now we wait." "How long?" Derek asked. 2 hours minimum. Don't touch it. Don't put a fan near it. Don't open the bay door if you can avoid it. He looked at the motorcycle. The cooling has to happen at the same rate the heating did. Patient and even. If you cool it too fast, everything we just did becomes useless. Marcus looked at his watch. It was 10:47 in the morning. He thought about Darnell Cruz. He thought about room 412. He picked up his phone and called Darnell. "How is he this morning?" Marcus asked. There was a pause on the line that said something before Darnell said anything. "He had a better morning," Darnell said. "He ate a little. He was more himself for about an hour." His voice softened at the edges in a way he couldn't entirely control. "He told me about the first time he rode Magdalena. He said it was November of 1977. He just turned 23. He said the engine was so cold it took him 7 kicks to get her started, and when she finally caught, he just sat there and let her run for 10 minutes before he moved because he was afraid if he shifted into gear, she'd stall and he'd lose the feeling." He paused. He remembers every detail. The temperature that day, what he was wearing, the sound she made when she finally settled into idle. Marcus pressed his back against the wall of his office and looked at the ceiling. "We're close," Marcus said. "We're not there yet, but we're close." "What does close mean?" Darnell asked. He asked it without demand, without pressure. He was genuinely asking what the word meant in the context of this specific situation. "It means we have a repair happening right now that we're waiting on," Marcus said. "If it holds, and I believe it's going to hold, we'll be ready to attempt a start by this afternoon." "Late afternoon," he paused. "Don't bring him here yet. I'll call you before I call you to come. I don't want him to make that trip and then find out we couldn't." He stopped. "I understand," Darnell said. "If anything changes before I call." Marcus said, "You call me, anytime, whatever time it is." "Okay," Darnell said. Marcus went back to the shop floor and told them what he'd told Darnell. He didn't dress it up. He said, "This is where we are. This is what it means to the man in that hospital room, and we have 2 hours before we know if the repair held, so let's use the time well." Walter, who had been listening from his stool, said, "The tires." Marcus looked at him. "The tires need to be replaced before the bike moves under any circumstance," Walter said. "Not aired up, replaced. The rubber has separated from the bead on both sides, and I saw delamination in the rear sidewall last night. These tires cannot hold pressure." Marcus looked at Joey. "I'll call around," Joey said. He already had his phone out. "You're not going to find shovelhead spec tires in stock locally," Walter said. "The tire sizes this bike uses are MT 9016 rear and MH 9021 front. Non-standard sizing. Most shops won't carry them." "What's the alternative?" Joey asked. "The closest compatible modern size is MT 90B16 in the rear. Dunlop and Metzler both make it. For the front, MH 90-21 is still manufactured. Shinko makes it." He looked at Joey. "Call Metzler first. If you explain the situation that it's a vintage restoration, that you need them same day, sometimes they expedite. Distributor for this region is in Greensboro." Joey was already dialing. While Joey worked the phone, Marcus turned to Derek. "I need you to start on the wheel bearings," he said. "Both wheels. We're not putting new tires on bearings we haven't inspected." Derek nodded and moved. He was working with a confidence now that he hadn't had 2 days ago. Not overconfidence, not the reckless enthusiasm of someone who didn't know what they didn't know, but the grounded competence of someone who had been taught well and had paid attention. Walter had done that. In 2 days, the old man had done that. Walter was sitting on his stool, and Marcus noticed he had his eyes closed. Not sleeping. His breathing was even and deliberate. Marcus had worked with enough older men to recognize what this was: someone managing pain through controlled stillness, using rest as a tool, the same way he used every other tool, precisely and without waste. "Walter," Marcus said quietly. Walter opened his eyes. "You need anything?" "I need that weld to cool correctly," Walter said. "I don't need anything else right now." Marcus nodded. He went to get them both coffee. At 12:20, while the weld was still cooling, Marcus's phone rang. The number on the screen was one he didn't recognize. He almost let it go. Then something made him answer. "Is this Marcus Webb's shop?" The voice was male, older, with a Carolinian flatness in the vowels. "This is Marcus," he said. My name is Gerald Bird. I ride with the Hells Angels Raleigh chapter. A pause. Chum. Darnell Cruz called some of our members this morning. He told them what you're doing with Raymond's bike. Marcus hadn't known Darnell had made those calls. He wasn't sure how he felt about it. Okay, he said carefully. I want you to understand something, Gerald Bird said. Raymond Cruz has been in that chapter for 19 years. He's one of ours. Whatever you need to finish this job, parts, money, somebody to drive somewhere and pick something up, you make a call and we will have it there. His voice was even unhurried and completely serious. I've got 8 guys on bikes right now who can move, any part, any distance, anytime. You tell me what you need. Marcus sat down. He had not anticipated this. He should have. Perhaps he knew enough about the culture to know how deeply those bonds ran, but he hadn't anticipated it, and the weight of it hit him in a place he hadn't expected. I've got tire sourcing in process, Marcus said. There may be a run to Greensboro. Done, Gerald said immediately. Give me the address when you have it. I'll have 2 guys there. There may be other parts, Marcus said. We won't know until we know. Call this number, Gerald said. Anytime, I mean anytime. 3 a.m. you call. Marcus said thank you, and he meant it in a way that required no elaboration and received none. He went to tell Walter. Walter listened. He nodded once. He said, good. Community is how these machines survive. Then he asked if Marcus had a specific weight of gear oil for the primary chain case, and they moved forward. The weld inspection happened at 12:55. Walter examined it under magnification. He ran a dye-penetrant inspection. Marcus had the kit from a previous job, and Walter had asked for it that morning before the weld was done. The process involved applying a red penetrant dye to the welded surface, letting it sit for 15 minutes, wiping it off, and then applying a white developer. If any porosity or cracks remained, the red dye would bleed back through the developer and mark them. The shop waited. Nobody talked. Joey had gotten confirmation on the tires. The Greensboro distributor had both sizes in stock, and 2 members of the Raleigh chapter were already en route. The tires would be back within 90 minutes. The wheel bearings on both wheels had been inspected. The rear showed acceptable wear. The front bearing had 1 ball that Derek had flagged as suspect, and Marcus had found a replacement in his bearing stock that was within spec. All of that had happened. All of that was progress. But none of it mattered if the developer showed red. Walter looked at the developer for a long time. He moved the magnifying glass slowly from one end of the repair to the other. He worked the branch fracture, last the most critical section, the one closest to the bearing bore. He set down the magnifying glass. He looked at Terrence. Clean, he said. Terrence let out a breath that had probably been compressed in his chest for the better part of 2 hours. Joey said yes quietly to himself. Derek put both hands flat on the workbench and dropped his head for a moment, and Marcus understood that he was 23 years old, and this was the first time anything this significant had come out in his favor, and the feeling was washing through him in a way he wasn't quite ready for other people to see. Marcus put his hand on Derek's shoulder briefly. 1 second. Then he looked at Walter. What's next, he said. Assembly, Walter said. He was already reaching for the engine cases. We've got a lot of work between here and a start attempt. Stop celebrating and start moving. The assembly was meticulous and unrelenting. Walter managed it from his stool in his occasional standing position, directing Derek's hands for the precision work. His right hand could no longer reliably execute, handling what he could himself with his left, asking Terrence for specific tasks that required the kind of engine sense that came from years rather than from instruction. He torqued the engine cases together using a sequence that Marcus had not encountered before, not the standard star pattern used on most engines, but a specific radial sequence that Walter explained was particular to cast iron cases with their different thermal expansion characteristics. Aluminum, you can run a star pattern, he said, because aluminum is forgiving. It compresses and springs back. Cast iron doesn't give. Cast iron wants even load distribution, or it'll develop micro cracks at the bolt bosses. Joey wrote that down. Walter noticed and said nothing, which was his version of approval. The oil pump went in next. Walter had them run a pre-prime check, filling the oil tank with fresh oil and turning the engine by hand through 2 full rotations to verify the pump was drawing before the engine was ever asked to fire. When the oil appeared at the rocker arm feed, holes in the correct volume and at the correct pressure for a hand-turned engine, Walter said, "Good, She's drinking. It was the first time Marcus had heard him use a pronoun for the bike. The primary chain case went on the new chain correctly tensioned the adjuster set to Walter's specification. He had Derek check the tension at 3 points around the chain's travel because a chain that's correctly tensioned in one position may be too tight or too loose in another depending on any variation in the sprocket concentricity. The chain was correct at all 3 points. The primary case was sealed. Fresh oil went in. At 2:45, the tires arrived. Gerald Bird's two riders had made the Greensboro run in just over an hour, which was not a leisurely pace. Marcus met them at the door, thanked them, and they declined coffee and departed without making anything of what they'd done. One of them, a heavy-set man with graying temples and a Raleigh chapter patch, paused at the door and looked at the shovel head on the shop floor. He looked at it for a moment with the specific quality of recognition that someone has when they look at something they have known for a long time. Raymond used to bring her here for runs, the man said. He wasn't talking to Marcus specifically. He was talking to the air. This bike was at every major run we did between '82 and 2009. You know how many miles that is? A lot, Marcus said. More than a lot, the man said. He looked at the bike for another moment. Then he looked at Marcus. He's one of the best men I've ever known. Whatever you're doing in here, he stopped. He put his hand briefly on Marcus's arm. One contact, no pressure, and then he went out the door. Marcus stood there for a moment with the feeling of it. Then he brought the tires to Derek. The tire mounting took 40 minutes. Derek worked quickly without sacrificing care, and Walter supervised the beads hitting the process of inflating the tire rapidly enough to force the rubber bead to seat properly against the rim. On modern tires on modern rims, this was routine. On old rims with slightly irregular bead seats from years of corrosion, it required attention. Both tires seated on the first attempt. Walter said, "Good," and moved on. The wheels went back on. The axles were torqued. The brake linkage was reconnected and adjusted. Walter checked brake function by hand, front lever, rear pedal, and found acceptable operation in both. By 4:15, the motorcycle was fully assembled, except for one thing: the fuel system. The fuel tank had been on the bike throughout the process, and now Walter asked for it to be removed. Marcus and Derek pulled it off. Walter had Joey drain what remained in it, a quantity of old fuel that looked like amber varnish, and flushed the tank interior with fresh fuel 3 times. He inspected the petcock, the fuel valve that controlled flow from the tank to the carburetor. The petcock was seized. Walter took it apart with a dental pick and a cotton swab, and 45 minutes of patience clearing the internal passages of sediment and freeing the valve mechanism. When he reassembled it and tested it against a shop light, fuel passed cleanly through the reserve and main positions. "Fresh fuel in the tank," he said. "Premium, not ethanol blend, standard premium if you have it." Marcus had a container of recreational fuel, ethanol-free, that he'd bought for a previous project. He used that. The tank went back on. The fuel line was connected. The petcock was open to the main position. They watched the carburetor for fuel seepage, any sign that the float valve wasn't seating and was going to flood the engine. The carburetor remained dry at the outside, which meant the float was closing correctly and fuel was entering the bowl at the proper rate. Walter crouched down and looked at the carburetor for a long moment. "The bowl is filling," he said. "Give it 5 minutes, then we choke it and try." Nobody said anything. The shop was very quiet. Marcus checked his watch. 4:58. The afternoon light through the windows had shifted to the lower angle of early evening, the kind of light that makes everything it touches look like it matters. Like the whole day has been building toward this specific quality of illumination. He thought I should call Darnell. Not yet. Not until he knew something worth saying. He thought Raymond Cruz is in that hospital right now. Room 412. And he doesn't know that the tank has fresh fuel in it, and the tires are new, and the rocker arm that was going to destroy the engine was machined from bar stock by a man who cared enough to get it right. He thought what a strange and specific mercy this is, that a 68-year-old man with a cane and arthritic hands would drive his 1989 truck to a shop he hadn't been to in 10 years because a stranger told him another stranger was dying and his bike hadn't run in 15 years. What a strange, exact, irreplaceable thing. "Walter," Marcus said. Walter looked at him from his crouch beside the carburetor. "Why did you come?" Marcus said. He didn't plan to say it. It came out because the moment had that particular honesty in it where things that haven't been said need to be. Walter was quiet for a moment. I came because I still can, he said. He stood up slowly, the cane taking his weight. 68 years old, and I can still do this. There are going to come mornings when I can't, and I don't know when that morning is. Could be a year from now, could be 10. He looked at the motorcycle. So when someone calls and says there's a machine that needs what I have, I come. Because the day I don't come when I still could, that's the day I'll know I've already become something less than who I was. He turned back to the carburetor. 5 minutes, he said, Mom. The 5 minutes passed in a silence so complete that Marcus could hear Joey's heartbeat. Or thought he could, or maybe it was his own. Walter picked up the enrichener lever, the choke. He looked at Marcus. You're going to kick it, he said. You know how to use a Kickstarter? I know the theory, Marcus said. Theory isn't enough on a shovel head, Walter said. The theory says push down. The practice is different. He looked at Marcus steadily. You find TDC first. You feel the compression come up, and then you feel it pass. That's top dead center. From there, you pull the compression release. There's a small lever on the left side of the engine. You press it, it bleeds the compression. Then you bring the kick lever to the top of its arc. You let it go through its full travel in one motion. Not two strokes, not a push and a recovery. One committed stroke, full weight, all the way to the bottom. If you pull your foot back before the lever reaches the bottom, you'll get kickback. You understand? Yes, Marcus said. If you get kickback and it catches your ankle, it will break it, Walter said. I've seen it happen. I've had it happen to me. He paused. So you commit, no hesitation, one stroke. I understand, Marcus said. Walter set the choke. Fuel on, fuel on. Derek confirmed. Ignition on. Joey checked. On. Throttle at rest. Marcus put his hand on the throttle, completely closed. At rest. Fine TDC, Walter said. Marcus found the kick lever. He pressed it down slowly, feeling for the compression. It came a distinct building resistance. He felt it peak and pass. He pressed the compression release lever and brought the kick arm back to the top. He looked at Walter. Walter gave him one single nod. Marcus kicked. The lever went through its full arc. The engine turned. It fired once, a single pop, ragged and incomplete, and died. The shop registered it. That pop, that one imperfect, brief, unmistakable sound from an engine that had been silent for 15 years. It wasn't a start, but it was evidence. It was the machine saying something is happening in here. Again, Walter said. His voice was completely even. Shorter choke this time. The bowl is flooded slightly from the first attempt. Marcus brought the choke off halfway. He found TDC again. Released the compression, brought the lever up, kicked. The engine turned. It fired twice this time, two distinct pulses, ragged and uneven but present, and died again. She's trying, Terrence said quietly. She's trying, Walter confirmed. Choke off completely. The fuel mixture is rich. She needs air. He paused. Third kick. Full commitment. Don't pull back. Marcus stood beside the motorcycle. He was breathing carefully. He put his foot on the kick lever. He thought about Raymond Cruz, about November 1977, about 7 kicks in the cold before the engine finally caught, and sitting there for 10 minutes just letting her run because he was afraid to move and lose the feeling. He found TDC, released compression, brought the lever to the top. And he felt in that moment, with the lever at the top of its arc and the whole weight of the last 3 days behind him, with Walter Boyd standing 4 feet away, and Terrence and Joey and Derek all stopped, all watching, all holding whatever they were holding, he felt something that he couldn't have put into a technical specification and couldn't have put into a report, but was as real as the iron under his hand. He felt the machine waiting. He kicked. The lever went down hard and fast and all the way. The engine turned. It fired. It kept firing. It coughed once, stuttered, dropped towards silence. And Walter said sharply, but without panic, "Throttle, small amount, now." And Marcus rolled the throttle open, the smallest amount, barely a movement, and the engine caught the fuel and pulled it in, and the firing became continuous, and the sound that filled the shop was something that none of them had words for in that moment. It was rough. It was ragged. It was uneven in a way that said 15 years in an imperfect advanced spring and 100 compromises made out of necessity and ingenuity in the refusal to give up. It was not a perfect sound. It was not a factory sound. It was not the sound of a machine in its prime. But it was running. The 1977 Harley-Davidson shovelhead Raymond Cruz's Magdalena was running. The men in the shop stood with it. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Not because there was a rule against it, but because the moment had a quality that didn't need anything added to it. After 3 days and 4 shops and 9 failed attempts, and a fractured engine case and a machined rocker arm and a phone call to a 68-year-old man with a cane, the engine was running, and that fact was complete in itself, and it needed to be heard before it needed to be celebrated. The idle was rough, oscillating in and out of stability. Marcus held the throttle at the small increment Walter had told him and let the engine do what it was going to do. Walter was listening, not watching, listening. His head was slightly tilted, his eyes not quite focused on anything visible. He was hearing something inside the engine sound underneath it, the way musicians hear individual instruments inside a full piece of music. And then his expression shifted, just slightly, just enough. "Cut the throttle," he said. Marcus closed the throttle. The engine dropped immediately to idle, and at idle in the relative quiet of reduced RPM, a sound became audible that hadn't been detectable over the roughness of the higher speed running. A tick, faint, rhythmic, coming from the top end. Marcus heard it. Terrence heard it. They all heard it. Walter let the engine idle for another 10 seconds. He listened to the tick. He measured it by ear, against the firing interval. He listened to its character, whether it was a sharp metallic tick or a softer, more organic knock. He listened to whether it changed with throttle input or remained constant. "Cut ignition," he said. Joey reached over and switched the ignition off. The engine ran for 2 more revolutions on residual compression and stopped. The shop was completely silent. Nobody asked the question. They all knew the question. They all waited for Walter to speak. Walter looked at the engine. He looked at it with that particular expression of his, not alarmed, not dismayed, but carrying whatever he'd heard and processing it with full seriousness. "The ticking is from the front exhaust rocker," he said. "It's the machined replacement." He paused. "The contact geometry is correct. The measurement was correct. But the surface hardness of the 4140 material is marginally higher than the original, which means the break-in contact pattern is different. The tick is the new surface establishing its wear pattern against the push rod tip." He looked at Terrence. "It's not a failure, it's a break-in noise." Terrence stared at him. "You're sure?" "I'm sure of what the sound tells me," Walter said. "I've heard that exact tick 3 times in my life. Twice on engines where someone replaced a rocker arm with aftermarket material. Once on an engine where someone had the original rebuilt by a machine shop that used a slightly different surface treatment." He paused. "In all 3 cases, the tick resolved itself within 45 minutes of operation." "And if it doesn't resolve," Marcus said, "then we revisit," Walter said simply. "But it will resolve." He said it with the same quality of certainty he'd used to tell Terrence that the well was possible. Not bravado, not reassurance designed to manage feelings, but an honest assessment from someone who had enough data in his history to be genuinely certain. Marcus put his hand on the engine. It was warm. Not hot warm, the warmth of an engine that had been running briefly, the heat of controlled combustion transmitted through iron and steel and 47 years of engineering. He pulled his hand back and looked at it for a moment, the way you look at your hand after it's touched something that matters. Then he looked at Walter. "I need to make a call," Marcus said. Walter nodded. Marcus picked up his phone. He dialed Darnell Cruz. It rang twice. Darnell answered on the second ring. "Marcus," he said. "It ran," Marcus said. The silence on the other end of the line lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Darnell Cruz, who was 29 years old and had learned to keep his voice controlled in situations where other men's voices broke, made a sound that was not a word. A short, compressed, entirely involuntary sound that contained everything that the last 3 days had been, everything that room 412 had held, everything that the photograph of a man laughing in 1991 had promised and almost lost. "Say that again," Darnell said. His voice was raw. "It ran," Marcus said. "She ran, Darnell. There's still work to do, but she ran." He paused. "Tell your uncle." Another silence. "Okay," Darnell said. It came out barely above a whisper. "Okay, I'm going right now." The line went quiet. Marcus lowered his phone and stood in the middle of his shop. The engine of the 1977 shovelhead ticked in its cooling rhythm, the small metallic percussion of hot metal, finding equilibrium, the sound a machine makes when it has been asked to do the impossible, and has begun against everything to comply. Walter sat on his stool. He had his hands folded in his lap, and his eyes were forward looking at the motorcycle, and his face had the quality of a man who has discharged something he carried for a long time, and is only now beginning to feel the absence of the weight. None of them spoke for a while. They didn't need to. The machine had spoken. The tick didn't stop. Marcus heard it first because he was standing closest to the engine during the cooldown, and he heard it the way you hear something you don't want to be hearing, with that specific internal resistance, the mind trying to reclassify the sound as something less serious than it knows it is. He waited another 30 seconds. He crouched down beside the engine and put his ear close and listened with the engine at rest, listening to the residual sounds of cooling metal, and the tick was still there. Not from thermal contraction, that sound was random and irregular. This was rhythmic. This was mechanical. He stood up. Walter was watching him. "You heard it too," Marcus said. It wasn't a question. "I never stopped hearing it," Walter said. Marcus checked his watch. It was 5:22. They had run the engine for approximately 4 minutes total across the start attempts, not 45 minutes. Not enough time for Walter's break-in theory to resolve itself. But the tick had persisted through the entire run, including the brief period when Marcus had given it throttle, and it hadn't diminished in character or frequency. "We need to run it longer," Derek said. He said it from across the shop where he'd been standing with Joey since the engine stopped, both of them caught in that suspended state between relief and uncertainty. "If Walter says it resolves at 45 minutes, we run it 45 minutes. "We can't run it 45 minutes right now," Terrence said. He said it carefully, not challenging Derek, but correcting him. "We can't put sustained load on this engine until we know the oil is circulating correctly through the full system. We ran it 4 minutes. We haven't done a proper oil check since it stopped." "Terrence is right," Walter said. He got off his stool and moved to the left side of the motorcycle, the oil tank side. He pulled the dipstick, a process that on a shovelhead required removing a specific bolt rather than a conventional dipstick tube, and looked at the oil level and condition. He looked at it for a moment. "Oil came back to the tank," he said. "Level is correct. Color is—" He paused. He tilted the bolt toward the light. "There's some discoloration, darker than it went in." "How dark?" Marcus said. "Darker than I want at 4 minutes of operation." He replaced the dipstick bolt. "It could be residual contamination from the internal passages cleaning themselves. Old varnish and debris. That's the optimistic interpretation." He paused. "The other interpretation is that there's combustion blow-by getting into the oil, which would mean a ring seal issue." "The shop absorbed that," Joey said. "Blow-by would mean the engine is—" "I know what blow-by means," Walter said. He wasn't sharp about it. He was simply efficient. "It means combustion gases are passing the piston rings and entering the crankcase. If the rings are worn, or if the cylinder walls have corroded past the point where the rings can seal against them, this engine cannot sustain operation without degrading its own oil supply." He set down the dipstick. "We need a compression test." Marcus already had the compression gauge in his hand. He'd pulled it from the cabinet the moment Walter mentioned oil discoloration, because after 3 days with this man, he'd learned to anticipate where his assessments were going and to be ready for the next step before it was requested. Walter looked at the gauge in his hand and said, "Good." The compression test required the engine to be warm. It wasn't fully warm. They'd run it for 4 minutes, but it was warmer than ambient, and a warm test was more accurate than a cold one. Walter specified the procedure: throttle wide open compression release, disabled 3 revolutions, minimum per cylinder. Marcus threaded the gauge into the front cylinder first. He kicked the engine through 3 times. The gauge needle climbed and held. 92 pounds, he read. Walter said nothing. Marcus moved to the rear cylinder. He threaded the gauge. He kicked through 3 times. 87 pounds. Walter was quiet for a moment. He looked at Terrence. "What's the service limit on a 77 shovelhead?" he said to Terrence. Not because he didn't know, because he wanted to know if Terrence did. Terrence didn't hesitate. "The factory spec is 120 to 140. Service limit, the minimum acceptable, is around 90. The front cylinder is at 92, Walter said, 2 pounds above the minimum acceptable limit for an engine in regular operation." He looked at the motorcycle. This is not an engine in regular operation. This is an engine we're asking to start and idle for the purpose of letting a dying man hear it run. He paused. For that purpose, 92 pounds is adequate. For anything else, it isn't. What about blow-by? Marcus said. The oil discoloration may be from the passages cleaning rather than from ring blow-by, Walter said. The compression numbers don't confirm severe ring failure. If the rings were completely gone, we'd see 50, 60 pounds. 92 is a worn engine, not a destroyed one. He paused. But I want to see the oil again after a longer run, because if it's blow-by, the discoloration will increase with running time. If it's passage cleaning, it'll stabilize or improve. So we run it again, Marcus said. We run it again, Walter said. But first we address the tick. Because if the tick is what I think it is, we handle it before a longer run. If the tick is something else, he stopped. Marcus waited. If it's something else, Walter said, then we have a problem that a longer run will make worse, not better. The diagnosis of the tick, which took 40 minutes, and it required opening the rocker box on the front cylinder. And when Derek pulled the cover in and they all looked inside, what Walter saw confirmed what he had and had not said the previous evening. The machined rocker arm was not the source of the tick. The source of the tick was the push rod that fed it. The push rod was slightly bent, not dramatically, not visibly to the naked eye, unless you rolled it on a flat surface, which Derek did at Walter's direction, and they all watched it describe a gentle, lazy wobble instead of the perfectly true rotation of a straight rod. Slightly bent, enough to alter the contact geometry between the push rod tip and the rocker arm, producing the rhythmic tick that Walter had heard, but had initially optimistically attributed to rocker arm break-in. The shop was very quiet. I should have caught that before assembly, Walter said. He said it simply, without drama, without self-flagellation. He said it the way an honest craftsman acknowledges a mistake, directly, factually, moving immediately toward the consequence. But Marcus heard something in it that went deeper than the technical admission, something in the quality of the pause that preceded it, and he understood that Walter Boyd was not accustomed to missing things. That missing this even something, this small, this understandable, given the conditions in the timeline, cost him something. It's a bent push rod, Terrence said carefully. It happens. It happens when you're moving too fast, Walter said. We were moving too fast. He looked at the rod. I should have rolled every push rod before I called them acceptable. I rolled the rear set. I didn't roll the front set because the front cylinder rocker showed the wear damage and I was focused on the rocker. I assumed the push rods were straight. He paused. Assumption is how things get missed. Derek said, can we replace it? Walter turned and looked at him, not with irritation, with something more considered than that. That's the right question, he said. Yes, we can replace it. A shovel head push rod is not an exotic component. The specification is straightforward, and the length and diameter can be matched from stock. He looked at Marcus. What do you have in push rod stock? Marcus went to his parts storage. He pulled 4 different push rods of various lengths and diameters and brought them to Walter. Walter measured each one with calipers, comparing against the original. This one, he said, handing one back to Marcus and setting the others aside. 3/1000ths shorter than the original, which means we'll need to adjust the tappet to compensate. But the diameter is correct and the end geometry matches. He looked at the push rod. Roll it. Marcus rolled it on the bench. It was true. That's our push rod, Walter said. The replacement took 20 minutes. Walter walked Derek through the tappet adjustment procedure, a process that required patience and a feeler gauge, and the understanding that on a shovel head tappet adjustment was done with the engine at specific rotation positions for each cylinder, and doing it in the wrong position produced a measurement that looked correct and was entirely wrong. Derek did it correctly. Walter checked his work. He checked it twice. Good, he said the second time. The rocker box cover went back on. The engine was ready for its second start attempt. But before Marcus reached for the kick lever, his phone rang. He looked at the screen. Darnell, he answered. Darnell. My uncle. Darnell's voice was different. The control that had characterized everything he'd said over the last 3 days had a crack running through it now. Fine but audible, the way the engine case had looked before Terrence welded it. He's had a setback. His blood pressure dropped again. They moved him to monitoring. There, he stopped. When he continued, his voice was lower and more careful, as if he was speaking quietly to avoid disturbing something. "They're saying it could be hours, or it could be days, but the doctor told me not to leave." Another pause. Is there any chance today?" Marcus looked at Walter. Walter was already looking at him. He'd heard enough of the conversation from 6 feet away to understand what was on the other end of the line. "Can you bring him here?" Marcus said. The question surprised himself when he said it. He hadn't planned it, but it came out because it was the only question that mattered. "He's in a hospital bed," Darnell said. "Can they transport him, even briefly? I know that's—" Marcus stopped. He started again. "I know that's an enormous ask, but if the bike can come to him instead, I'd bring it, except hospital parking lots aren't—" He was thinking as he spoke. "There's a way to do this. There has to be." He looked at Walter. "Is there a way to bring the bike to the hospital?" Marcus said. "Yes." Walter picked up his cane. He thought for a moment with a particular focused quality that was entirely his own, not hesitant, not impulsive, but genuinely calculating the variables. "The engine needs to run long enough to verify the oil situation and allow the rocker to seat," he said. 20 minutes minimum, ideally 30. We can't transport the bike immediately after starting it." He paused. "But if we run it here for 30 minutes, verify all systems, then load it on a trailer and take it to the hospital." He stopped. "We'd need an outdoor area near his room where we could run it with him present." "The parking structure," Marcus said. He didn't know why he knew this, but he did. St. Mary's had a parking structure adjacent to the main building, and the third level was partially open. He'd been there before, visiting his own father 6 years ago. "The third level of the parking structure is open on 2 sides. We could run the bike there if we had permission." He looked at Walter. "Would that work mechanically?" "The engine doesn't care where it runs," Walter said. "As long as the fuel system is stable and the air is clean, it'll run anywhere." He paused. "Get permission. I'll prepare the bike for transport." Marcus put the phone back to his ear. "Darnell, call the hospital administration right now. Tell them what's happening. Ask for permission to run a motorcycle engine in the open section of the parking structure, 3rd level. Tell them it's a dying patient's last request. Tell them it will take 30 minutes. Tell them we'll have people on site to control the situation." He paused. "If they say no, I'll come there myself and ask in person. Don't take no from a phone call." A short silence. "I'll call right now," Darnell said. The line went dead. Marcus put his phone in his pocket and looked at everyone in the shop. Joey and Derek and Terrence and Walter, all of them looking back at him with the specific expression of people who have just understood that the plan has changed and the stakes have simultaneously increased. "We have maybe an hour," Marcus said. "Let's start her up and run the verification." The second start was cleaner than the first. Marcus found TDC on the second attempt. He'd learned the engine's compression character, now the particular way the resistance built and released, and his body had calibrated to it. He committed the kick with the full weight and intention that Walter had described, and the engine fired on the first stroke and kept firing. The idle settled faster this time. Still rough, still carrying the particular uneven signature of an old engine relearning its rhythms, but noticeably more stable than the initial run. The tick was gone. The front cylinder was breathing correctly through its new pushrod, and the sound that came from the engine was, if not smooth, then genuine, the deep, loping, slightly offbeat pulse of a 47-year-old shovelhead that had been asleep for 15 years and was waking up by degrees. Walter stood beside the engine and listened. He listened for 2 minutes without moving or speaking. Then he said, "Give it some throttle," slowly. Marcus rolled the throttle open. The engine climbed an RPM, found a higher register, steadied. The sound filled the shop in a way that changed its character entirely. It was no longer just a sound, it was a presence. The engine occupying the space was something that felt physical, that moved through the chest the way certain music moves. Derek was standing with his fist pressed against his mouth. Terrence had his arms crossed and was nodding very slowly, not deliberately, just the involuntary movement of a man whose body is responding to something before his mind has processed it. Joey had turned away. Marcus noticed this and understood it. Joey was 26 years old, and he was feeling something that his technical framework hadn't prepared him for, something that didn't have a name in the vocabulary of diagnostics and fault codes, and he needed a moment's privacy with it. Walter said, "Back to idle." Marcus closed the throttle. The engine settled back to its loping idle. Walter crouched beside the oil tank and pulled the dipstick. He looked at it. He held it toward the light. The oil was darker than it had been after the first run. Not dramatically darker, but incrementally the color of used oil rather than the color of oil processing debris. Walter set the dipstick down. He looked at Marcus, and his face was doing the careful, neutral thing it did when he was holding something complicated. "It's blow-by," Marcus said. "It's consistent with blow-by," Walter said. "It doesn't rule out passage contamination completely, but the rate of darkening suggests blow-by is contributing." He paused. "The front cylinder, which showed the lower compression, is almost certainly the source." The shop held that. "What does it mean for the hospital run, Ectia?" Terrence said. "It means the engine cannot be run at high RPM for extended periods," Walter said. "If blow-by is occurring, running the engine hard accelerates oil degradation and could lead to insufficient lubrication at the top end." He paused. "For our purposes, 30 minutes of idle and light throttle in a parking structure, it is manageable. The oil won't degrade past safe limits in 30 minutes of light operation." He looked at Marcus directly. "But you need to understand, this engine is not fixed. It is not restored. It is functional for a specific and limited purpose. Anyone who rides it after today will need to address the ring situation before the bike is roadworthy." "Darnell knows that," Marcus said. "Make sure he does," Walter said, in writing. "I won't put my name to a machine I'm not certain is safe for road use." "Understood." Marcus looked at his watch. 6:14. He looked at the motorcycle. He made a decision. "Let's load it." His phone rang as Derek and Terrence were positioning the trailer. It was Darnell. They said yes, Darnell said, and his voice carried the specific quality of a man who has won a fight he wasn't sure he could win. "Third level of the parking structure, north end open bay. Hospital administrator and the head nurse on Raymond's floor both approved it. They're going to bring him up in a wheelchair. They said he's stable enough for transport within the building." He stopped. "He doesn't know yet. I wanted it to be a surprise." Marcus felt something move in his chest that he couldn't and wouldn't have described to anyone. "We'll be there in 40 minutes, Marcus said. He looked at Walter. Walter said, "Make it 35. The bike loaded onto the trailer with Marcus and Derek managing the ramps and Terrence at the wheel of the shop's pickup truck. Walter supervised the tie-down, checking each strap with his good left hand, checking the front wheel chock twice. He wasn't going to lose the machine to a shifting load on a 15-minute drive. They were on the road by 6:31. Marcus rode in the truck with Terrence. Joey and Derek followed in Joey's car. Walter rode in the truck's passenger seat, the canvas bag between his feet, his cane across his knees. They drove. The radio was off. Nobody suggested turning it on. The silence in the truck was not uncomfortable. It was inhabited the way silences become when everyone in a shared space is thinking about the same thing and knows the others are thinking about it too. "Walter," but Marcus said, "Yeah, when this is over, when we're done at the hospital, I want to know what I owe you." Walter was quiet for a moment. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "I mean for the work," Marcus said. 3 days, consultation, labor parts, sourcing." "I know what you mean," Walter said, "and I'm telling you nothing, and don't write me a check. Don't put an envelope on my truck seat. If you do, I'll mail it back." Marcus looked at the road. "Why?" he said. Walter shifted in the seat. The cane moved slightly. He looked out the window at the passing city, the evening light on the storefronts and the traffic and the ordinary movement of people going about the ordinary business of a weekday evening, none of them aware that on the trailer behind this truck was a machine that a man was dying toward. "My father's panhead," Walter said. "When my brother and I got the hospital's permission to start it in that parking lot, you know who helped us? An old man, nobody we'd ever met. He was a patient at the hospital visiting someone else, and he heard us struggling with the timing, and he just walked over and asked if he could have a look. He'd worked panheads in the 60s. He knew them." Walter paused. "He had the bike running in the 20 minutes. My father heard it from his room. We never got that man's name." He stopped. "I've been looking for a way to pay that forward for 22 years. I don't know if this is what it looks like, but I think it might be." Marcus drove. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "Your father," when he heard the panhead running. "What did he do?" Walter's voice, when he answered, had a different quality than it had had at any point in the 3 days Marcus had known him. Not softer exactly, more unguarded, more present. He waved his hand and Walter said, just once, from the window, like he was greeting someone on the road. He paused. That was the last clear thing he did. He died 4 days later. Another pause. But he waved. The truck was quiet. Terrence, who had been silent the entire drive, reached over and turned the heater down slightly, just to have something to do with his hand. Marcus drove. St. Mary's parking structure, third level north end. They had it to themselves. The hospital had cleared the nearby spaces. A security guard stood at the ramp to manage traffic, and he waved them through without speaking when he saw the trailer. Marcus backed the trailer into position with Terrence guiding him from outside. They unloaded the bike with the same care they had loaded at ramp's wheel, chalk one person on each side. Walter stayed on the ground directing his cane steady on the concrete. When the shovel head was on its kickstand on the third level of the parking structure open to the evening air, on two sides of the city visible beyond the concrete barriers, Marcus stepped back and looked at it. 47 years old, 15 years silent, 3 days of work by 5 men, a machined rocker arm that hadn't existed 4 days ago, a welded fracture, a replacement push rod from a spare parts drawer, new tires that 2 men had driven to Greensboro to get, a carburetor cleaned pass by patient pass, an ignition system timed by hand against a spring that wasn't quite right but was close enough to matter. All of it for this. For 30 minutes of idle in a hospital parking structure so that one man could hear his motorcycle run one more time before the gap between his life and the end of it closed completely. Marcus put his hand on the tank. Then Darnell called. "We're bringing him up," Darnell said. His voice was tight, controlled, everything compressed into it. 2 minutes. "We're ready," Marcus said. He looked at Walter. Walter was checking the petcock. He was checking the choke. He was checking every item on his mental checklist because he was 68 years old and meticulous, and he had no intention of having the engine fail to start now, in this specific place, at this specific moment, in front of a man who had traveled from a hospital bed in a wheelchair to hear it. "She'll start," Walter said without Marcus saying anything. He said it the way he said things he was sure of, without elaboration, without performance. Just the fact. "I know," Marcus said. 2 minutes passed, then 3, then a sound from the elevator, the ding of the doors opening, then the soft mechanical hum of a wheelchair, and then Darnell Cruz came around the corner pushing a man who was both more and less than Marcus had expected. More because Raymond Cruz, at 67, in a hospital gown under a jacket that Darnell had brought for him in a wheelchair with an oxygen line running from a portable unit on the chair's back, was still recognizably the man in the 1991 photograph. The structure of his face was the same, the dark eyes, the particular set of the jaw, the quality of attention in his expression that was even now alert and present. Life had compressed him, illness had thinned him, but he was there completely, there with a quality of presence that Marcus hadn't expected and couldn't have predicted. Less because he was tired in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. The tiredness was in his bones and the effort it took to hold his head at the angle he was holding it in the pause between each breath. He was a man spending the last of something finite, and anyone who looked at him knew it. He came around the corner and he saw the motorcycle. He stopped. Darnell stopped pushing. Raymond Cruz looked at the shovelhead for a long moment. He looked at it the way the man in the photograph had looked at the camera, with full attention, with the quality of someone who is not performing their feeling, but actually having it. Then he looked at Marcus. "You fixed her," Raymond said. His voice was rough and quiet, the voice of a man who had been conserving it. "We made her run," Marcus said. "She's not fully fixed, but she runs." Raymond nodded slowly. He looked at the bike again. "Magdalena," he said. Nobody else said anything. Raymond looked around. He saw Walter saw the cane, the white hair, the flannel shirt, the worn hands. He looked at him for a moment. "You're the one," Raymond said. "You're the one who knew how." Walter met his eyes. "I knew some of it," he said. "Your bike knew the rest." Raymond held his gaze for another moment. Then he looked at the motorcycle. "Can I?" He stopped. He tried again. "Can you start her? I want to hear her from here. I don't need to be next to her. I just want to hear." "Right now," Marcus said. He moved to the motorcycle. He went through the checklist out loud as he performed it, not for his own benefit, but for Raymond's fuel on choke set throttle, at rest ignition on each item, a kind of acknowledgement that this was real, that this was happening, that the thing was actually about to occur. He found the kick lever. He looked at Raymond Cruz. Raymond looked back at him. Marcus kicked. The engine fired on the first stroke. It fired and kept firing, the rough, uneven, deeply alive sound of a 1977 shovelhead climbing from silence to idle, filling the open third level of the parking structure with a sound that bounced off the concrete and expanded into the evening air, and was not clean and was not perfect and was without any qualification at all magnificent. Raymond Cruz closed his eyes. He closed them not in pain and not in relief, but in the specific, deliberate way of a man who wants to receive something fully without the distraction of sight, with the complete attention of someone who understands that a moment is happening and has chosen to be entirely present inside it. He sat with the sound. The engine ran. Darnell stood behind the wheelchair with both hands on the handles and his head down and his shoulders doing the thing that shoulders do when someone is crying and trying not to be seen doing it. Joey and Derek stood together near the elevator, and neither of them moved. Terrence had turned away slightly, the same way he sometimes turned away in the shop, and his face was pointed toward the city beyond the barriers. Walter stood still and let the engine run, and watched Raymond Cruz listening to it, and his face had that quality Marcus had seen in it when Walter talked about his father's wave from the window open, and old, and not performing anything. The engine ran. Marcus stood beside the motorcycle with his hand on the throttle, and kept it at idle and let the machine do the one thing it had been asked to do, the one impossible, necessary, specific thing. And then 20 seconds into the run, 30-35, Raymond Cruz opened his eyes. He was crying. He made no move to hide it. He simply let it happen the way a man lets it happen when he has moved past the point where concealment seems like something worth the energy. His face was wet and his shoulders were shaking slightly, and he was looking at the motorcycle with an expression that contained so many things simultaneously: love and grief and gratitude, and something older than any of those words, something that didn't have a name, but that every person on that level of the parking structure recognized, because they were all in that moment feeling a version of it. "There she is," Raymond said. His voice barely carried over the engine. "There she is." And then Marcus heard it. He heard it because he was standing right next to the engine, and he had been listening to it with the full attention of 3 days' worth of learned familiarity, and it registered in his body before his mind processed it, a change in the engine's sound. Not the tick, not the blow-by, something different. A slight irregularity in the firing cadence, a fraction of a cycle where the combustion wasn't completing at the same interval as the previous cycles. He looked at Walter. Walter had already moved. He was at the engine, his left hand against the primary case. His head tilted and his face had shifted into the particular focused neutrality that Marcus now knew was his alarm condition. Not panic, but the maximum concentration of everything he had. Marcus held the throttle steady. He didn't change anything. He waited. The irregularity came again and again. Walter turned and looked at Marcus. Marcus looked back at him. Walter said nothing. He didn't have to. His expression said that something was happening inside that engine that hadn't been happening before. Something that needed to be evaluated immediately. Something that the next 60 seconds would determine was serious or survivable. And the engine was running directly in front of Raymond Cruz, who had his eyes closed again, who was sitting in a wheelchair with an oxygen line and a borrowed jacket and 15 years of waiting behind him. And the sound of the engine was the only thing in the world right now. The only thing that mattered, and Marcus Webb stood beside the throttle and made a decision in less than 1 second. He did not cut the engine. He held the throttle steady. He looked at Walter. He held his eyes and shook his head once, one small definitive movement that said, "Not yet." Walter looked at him. The engine ran. The irregularity came once more, and then in the way of old engines making their accommodation with the demands placed on them, it settled. The cadence returned to its rough, loping, imperfect steadiness. The combustion found its interval again. The sound that filled the parking structure was the sound of a machine that had been through something but had not been beaten by it. By Hoyt. Raymond Cruz opened his eyes. He was still crying. He looked at the motorcycle with the expression of a man looking at something he loves. Walter exhaled. It was the smallest sound, almost nothing, but Marcus heard it and understood completely what it contained. Walter reached into his canvas bag. He pulled out a small flashlight, and while the engine ran, he bent and looked at the primary case from below, checking for oil seepage, checking the case repair, checking every surface he could access without stopping the engine. He worked quickly and silently, his movements precise, covering everything he could assess without cutting the ignition. He straightened up. He looked at Marcus and gave a single nod. The nod said, "It's holding." Marcus breathed. The engine ran on. Darnell had moved from behind the wheelchair to beside his uncle. He had his hand on Raymond's shoulder, not gripping it, just resting there connected. Raymond had his hand up, and he'd put it over Darnell's hand without looking at him. The two of them sat that way, and the engine ran, and the city existed somewhere beyond the concrete barriers, and none of the 5 men who had brought this machine to this place said anything at all. They gave the moment to Raymond Cruz, to whom it belonged. The engine ran for 22 minutes. At 22 minutes, Walter came to Marcus and said quietly, close enough that only Marcus could hear, "The oil situation. Much longer, and I can't guarantee the lubrication margin." Marcus nodded. He looked at Raymond. Raymond was still watching the motorcycle. He had stopped crying, or rather, the crying had spent itself and left behind something quieter, something that looked less like grief and more like peace, the specific peace of a man who has been given back something he thought was gone. "Mr. Cruz," Marcus said. Raymond looked at him. "I need to shut her down," Marcus said. He said it directly without softening it into something it wasn't. "The engine is managing well, but there are limits to how long we should run her today." Raymond looked at the motorcycle for a long moment. "Will she run again?" he asked. Marcus thought about the blow-by. He thought about the compression numbers. He thought about the ring seal and what it meant for the future of the engine. "With the right work," Marcus said, "the ring situation needs to be addressed. It's not a small job." But, he paused, "the cases are solid. The valve train is correct. The carburetor is clean. The foundation is there." He held Raymond's eyes. "She has more miles in her. Not today, but they're there." Raymond looked at him steadily. "You're not just telling me that," Raymond said. It was not a question. "I'm not just telling you that," Marcus said. "Walter Boyd will tell you the same thing, and Walter doesn't say things he doesn't mean." Raymond turned and looked at Walter. Walter looked back at him. "There's life in that engine," Walter said. "Real life, not borrowed time." He paused. "Get the rings done and she'll ride again." Raymond Cruz looked at the motorcycle one more time. Then he looked at Marcus. "Okay," he said. "Okay." He nodded once, slow and deliberate, the nod of a man making peace with something. "Shut her down." Marcus reached for the ignition. He paused for 1 second. Just one. He let the sound exist for one more second in the air of that open parking structure, bouncing off concrete and expanding into the evening. The rough and imperfect and completely genuine sound of a machine that had been given back its life by people who refused to accept that it was over. Then he cut the ignition. The engine ran through its last 2 revolutions on compression and stopped. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Marcus Webb had heard in years. Raymond Cruz sat in the silence with his head slightly bowed, and nobody moved, and the city went on existing beyond the barriers, and the evening light was that low gold that makes everything it touches look like it is being seen for the first time or the last time, and sometimes there is no difference between those two things. The silence after the engine stopped was the kind that fills a space completely, the way water fills a vessel, not empty silence, not uncomfortable silence, but silence with weight and texture and meaning, the silence of something having been completed. Raymond Cruz sat in it with his head slightly bowed and his hand still over Darnell's hand on his shoulder. And nobody on that parking level moved or spoke, because all of them understood without discussion that this moment belonged entirely to the man in the wheelchair, and that the most respectful thing anyone could do was stay out of it. Raymond stayed that way for almost a full minute. Then he lifted his head. He looked at the motorcycle. He looked at it the way he'd looked at it when Darnell first wheeled him around the corner and the shovelhead was sitting there on its kickstand with full attention, with the quality of someone who is receiving something rather than observing it. Then he looked at Marcus, then at Walter, then he looked one by one at Terrence, at Joey, at Derek. He took his time. He looked at each of them completely, the way a man looks at people he wants to remember. "How many days?" he said. "3, Marcus said. Raymond shook his head slowly, not in disbelief, in a kind of wondering that had passed beyond surprise into something quieter. 3 days, he said. He looked at the shovelhead again. "She gave you trouble?" Marcus felt a sound try to come out of him that was somewhere between a laugh and something else entirely. He controlled it. "She gave us everything she had," he said. Raymond nodded. He understood that. "She always did," he said. He was quiet for a moment. I want to know their names, Raymond said. He was speaking to Darnell now, but looking at Marcus. All of them. Write them down for me. I want to know every name. Darnell pulled out his phone. Marcus said the names. Walter Boyd, Terrence Okafor, Joey Reyes, Derek Paulson. He said them clearly without rushing while Darnell typed. Raymond listened to each one with the focused quality of a man committing something to memory, or rather with the quality of a man who understands that his memory may not be the vessel for this and is making sure someone else carries it correctly. When Marcus finished, Raymond looked at Walter. Come here, Raymond said. Walter walked to him, the cane marking the concrete. He stopped in front of the wheelchair. Raymond looked up at him. Walter looked down. Two old men, one dying in a borrowed jacket, one still moving with a cane and worn hands, in 45 years in the trade, looking at each other with the complete unguarded recognition of people who have reached the age where pretense is a resource they've both decided not to spend. You're the one who knew the machines, Raymond said. I knew this one well enough, Walter said. How old are you? 68. Raymond almost smiled. Almost. Something moved at the corner of his mouth that had the shape of it. I've got you by a year, he said. 67, though I don't feel it right now. Nobody feels their age when they're listening to an engine run, Walter said. Raymond looked at him for another moment, then he put his hand out. Walter took it. His left hand, his good hand, closed around Raymond's and held it, and neither of them moved for a moment, and the handshake was not the quick functional gesture of an introduction, but something slower and more deliberate, two men acknowledging something that didn't require language. Thank you, Raymond said. Walter said, she's going to need those rings. Raymond's almost smile completed itself this time, became real brief, containing the specific humor of a man who appreciates directness. I know she is, he said. Darnell's going to handle it. Darnell, standing behind the chair, said, yes, I am. Marcus's shop, Raymond said. He looked at Marcus. If you'll take it. We'll take it, Marcus said. Raymond nodded. He settled back slightly in the wheelchair, and Marcus saw in that settling the cost of what the evening had taken from him physically, the reserves he'd spent on this 1 hour, the energy that would need to be rebuilt from a pool that wasn't refilling the way it once did. But his face didn't carry defeat. His face carried the specific piece Marcus had seen there after the engine shut down, something closed and complete, the expression of a man who has settled a debt he'd been carrying. I need to go back, Raymond said to Darnell. Not urgently, simply factually. I'm good, but I need to go back. Okay, Uncle Ray, Darnell said. His voice was steady and careful and entirely controlled, which Marcus had come to understand was how Darnell Cruz expressed love through the discipline of not falling apart in front of someone who needed him present. Raymond looked at the motorcycle one last time. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said quietly to the machine, and to no one in particular, there you are, Magdalena. There you are. And then he let Darnell wheel him away. The loading of the motorcycle onto the trailer afterward happened in a silence that was different from the silence of the engine stopping. Functional silence, the silence of men doing physical work while carrying something internal that the work gave them a place to put. Marcus guided the front wheel. Derek managed the ramp. Terrence drove the truck into position. Walter checked the tie-downs. Joey, who had been quiet since the engine started, who had stood near the elevator and watched Raymond Cruz receive 22 minutes of something he'd been moving toward for 3 days, came and helped load. Without being asked, just appeared at the right moment and put his hands on the right part of the bike, and nobody commented on it because that was simply who Joey was when the situation required it. When the bike was secure and the ramps were up, Marcus went and stood beside the trailer for a moment. Just stood there. He put his hand on the shovelhead's front fender, the same gesture he'd made in the shop palm flat against metal, and held it there. Walter came to stand beside him. They stood without speaking for a moment, both of them looking at the machine on the trailer. The rings, Marcus said. Yes, Walter said. Will you help when Darnell brings it back in? Walter was quiet for a moment. He shifted his weight on the cane. A top-end rebuild on a shovelhead, he said. Cylinder honing ring, fitting possibly a valve job if the seats have worn. Could take the better part of a week. I know, Marcus said. I'm 68 years old, Walter said. I have a bad right hand, and I walk with a Roentgen, and my back tells me about it every morning. I know that too, Marcus said. Walter looked at the motorcycle. He looked at it for a long moment with that reading quality. His eyes had taken in information at a pace determined by the thing itself, rather than by his own impatience. Yes, he said, I'll help. Marcus nodded. Good, he said. They loaded up and drove back to the shop in the dark, the trailer lights behind them, the city moving past on both sides, ordinary and continuous, and entirely unaware of what had just happened on the third level of a hospital parking structure. Darnell came to the shop the next morning. He came alone without the bike, and Marcus understood, before he said anything, that this was a different kind of visit. Not a logistics call, not a question about the ring work, but something that needed to be said in person and had been composing itself in Darnell overnight. Marcus was alone in the shop when Darnell arrived. The others hadn't come in yet. The shovelhead was parked in the corner where they'd put it the night before off the main floor, its kickstand down, the new tires gleaming slightly in the morning light. Darnell stood in the middle of the shop and looked at it. He slept last night, Darnell said. Real sleep. The nurses said they hadn't seen him sleep like that in 2 weeks. He paused. The doctor said his vitals were better this morning than they've been in 10 days. Explained it as the psychological effect of his word was resolution. Said that people sometimes stabilize when they have been given something they were holding out for. He stopped. He looked at Marcus. I don't know if that's what it was. I don't either, Marcus said. I think it might have been, Darnell said. He looked at the motorcycle again. He talked this morning, more than he has in weeks. He told me about a run they did in 1989, 9 bikes 3 days from Raleigh to the coast and back. He said Magdalena ran so smooth that whole trip that he kept checking the gauges because he couldn't believe an engine could run that well for 3 days straight. A pause. He laughed telling it. I haven't heard him laughing. He stopped. His jaw worked in the way Marcus recognized from the first day Darnell had come into the shop. A long time. Marcus sat on the stool near the bench and let Darnell talk. Darnell talked for 20 minutes. He talked about Raymond, not the medical situation, not the details of the decline, but Raymond himself, the man as he'd known him his whole life. The uncle who had taught him to ride a bicycle when he was 6 because his father was working 2 jobs and didn't have the hours. The uncle who had shown up to every significant event of his childhood and adolescence with the reliability of weather, not always able to stay long, not always at ease in the school auditorium or the church pew, but always there. The man who had, when Darnell was 16 and in the middle of the particular crisis of that age, taken him for a ride on the shovelhead. The only time in his life, Darnell had ridden it pillion behind Raymond on a long Sunday afternoon loop through the country roads north of the city and said almost nothing the entire ride, which was exactly the right thing to say. Marcus listened. He listened the way Walter had listened to machines, completely, without interrupting, giving the thing that was speaking the time and space to say what it needed to say. When Darnell finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I don't know how to thank you. I've been thinking about it since last night, and I don't have the words. You don't need them, Marcus said. I know that's what people say, Darnell said, but I mean it specifically. There isn't... He stopped. He started again. 4 shops turned us away. 9 attempts. My uncle asked me maybe 6 weeks ago if I thought we'd ever hear her run again, and I told him I was still trying, but the truth was... He looked at the floor briefly. The truth was I'd started to believe we wouldn't. He looked back at Marcus. And then you didn't turn us away. Marcus thought about what he'd said to Darnell on that first day. I'm not going to tell you it's possible, and I'm not going to tell you it isn't. He thought about whether that had been courage or simply the inability to say no to the 8 words Darnell had said in the middle of the shop. He thought it was probably both. Most things were. Walter Boyd is who you should thank, Marcus said. What he did here, what he knew, what he was willing to bring, that's not something that exists in a shop like mine normally. I was going to call you and tell you we couldn't do it. Darnell looked at him. I know, Marcus said. I was going to call you before I called Walter. I had the words ready. He paused. And then I looked at that photograph you left, the one from 1991. He looked at the shovelhead, and I made one more call instead. Darnell was quiet for a moment. Where'd you find him? He said. Old contact, Marcus said. We worked together once years ago. I wasn't sure he'd answer. I wasn't sure if he answered that he'd come. He paused. He came. Why? Darnell said. Marcus thought about Walter's answer to that same question in the truck on the drive to the hospital. The story about the panhead in the parking lot and the old man who'd walked over because he heard someone struggling with a timing problem. The story about his father's wave from the window. The 22 years of looking for a way to pay that forward. He had a reason of his own, Marcus said. You'd have to ask him. Darnell nodded. He looked at the motorcycle one more time. I'm going to bring her back, he said. As soon as my uncle is, as soon as I can. He stopped. He was measuring something internally, deciding how directly to say the next part. I want her to be right, not just running. Right, all the way. He looked at Marcus. Whatever it costs. We'll do it right, Marcus said. They shook hands. Darnell's hand was strong and warm and held the grip for a moment longer than a functional handshake required, which meant something, and both of them knew it. Then Darnell went to the door. He stopped. He turned around. Marcus. He said the name with the particular weight of someone about to say the actual thing they came to say. When my uncle was listening to the engine last night, with his eyes closed, just sitting there, he had this expression. I've been trying to figure out what it was. I've been trying to name it since last night. He paused. I think it was relief, not happiness, not gratitude. Relief, like he'd been holding something for a very long time, and he finally got to set it down. He looked at Marcus steadily. You gave him that, all of you. You gave him that. He went out. Marcus sat in the empty shop for a while. Then he went to the shovel head and checked the oil. Old habit. He pulled the dipstick and looked at it in the morning light. The oil was dark from the previous evening's run, dark with blow-by and the honest wear of an engine that had given everything it had. But the level was correct, and when Marcus held the dipstick toward the window light and looked at the oil's surface, he saw no metal particles, no silvering, no evidence of catastrophic wear. What he saw was the oil of an engine that was tired but not broken, an engine that had earned its rest and knew as much as metal and chemistry can know anything that there was more ahead. He replaced the dipstick carefully. He put his hand on the tank one more time, palm flat. All right, Magdalena, he said quietly. Let's get you right. 3 weeks later, Walter Boyd came back. Not because Marcus had called him. Marcus had called him twice to discuss the ring job, to talk through the cylinder specifications and what honing equipment they'd need and where to source the correct ring set for the 77 bore. Those calls had been technical and productive, and Walter had been, as always, precisely and usefully himself. But the third time Walter showed up at the shop, he came without a call, arriving at 8 in the morning in his 1989 F-150 with the canvas bag on the seat beside him. And when Marcus came to the door to meet him, Walter simply said, Darnell called me. He said you were ready to start the top end. We were waiting on a part, Marcus said. Got it yesterday. I know, Walter said. He told me. He came through the door. He set his bag on the bench. He took off his jacket and rolled his flannel sleeves to the elbow. He looked at the shovel head. Let's look at where we are. He was there for 4 days. The top-end rebuild was a different kind of work. From the resurrection, less desperate, less compressed by time, but in its own way more demanding, because now they were not working toward a minimum viable outcome. They were working toward correct. Toward the ring job Marcus had told Raymond Cruz was possible, toward the miles he'd said were still in the engine. Walter honed the front cylinder bore by hand, a process that required a flex hone on a slow drill and a light touch, and the kind of patience that machine work demands from people who respect what the machine is for. He talked Derek through it, then watched Derek do it, then checked Derek's work with bore gauges and said, again, but lighter. And Derek did it again lighter, and the second measurement was right. Joey sourced the ring set through 3 different suppliers before finding the correct specification for the 1977 bore. He learned in the process more about vintage Harley-Davidson parts sourcing than he had in his entire previous career, including which suppliers were reliable and which ones would tell you they had a part when what they actually had was something close but not identical. Walter had strong opinions about this distinction and communicated them clearly. Terrence did the valve seat work on the front cylinder. The exhaust seat had worn to the point where it needed cutting, not dramatically, not catastrophically, but enough that a proper seal required a fresh cut and a new valve face lapping. He had the equipment, he had the skill, he did it correctly, and when he was done, he handed the head to Walter, who inspected the seat contact pattern on the valve face with the magnifying glass and said, "That's right." Those 3 words from Walter Boyd Marcus had come to understand over the course of this job meant what they meant. They were not encouragement. They were not management. They were an honest assessment from someone with the authority to make it, and they meant you did this correctly, full stop. On the 4th day, the engine went back together. The new rings went in with the correct end gaps checked individually and confirmed. The honed bores accepted them cleanly, the compression rings settling into the grooves with the precise fit that had been absent from the worn originals. The head went back on with new gaskets and fresh hardware. The valve train was reassembled with the patience it required, every clearance verified, every component confirmed against the spec sheet Walter had brought from his truck on the first morning and had kept in his shirt pocket every day since. The afternoon of the 4th day, when the engine was fully assembled and the oil was fresh and the fuel was in the tank and everything that could be verified had been verified, they stood around the motorcycle in the same configuration they'd stood in for the first start attempt. Marcus at the kick lever, Walter on his stool, Terrence and Joey and Derek in their positions, the specific gravitational arrangement of 5 people who had been through something together and knew their places in it. But this time there was someone else. Darnell Cruz was standing near the bay door. He had come in an hour before and said almost nothing, just asked if he could be there for the start, and Marcus had said of course, and no one had commented on his presence or his quiet because his quiet was self-explanatory. His uncle had stabilized over the previous 3 weeks, not recovered, not reversed, but achieved a plateau that the doctors attributed to that same psychological effect of resolution they described after the parking structure evening. He was still in and out of St. Mary's. He was still diminished, but he was still there, still talking, still telling stories about rides in 1989 and the way an engine sounded when it ran exactly right. Still there, and Darnell stood near the bay door and watched Marcus find TDC on the rebuilt engine for the first time and find the compression and bring the kick lever to the top, and he watched Marcus kick. The engine fired on the first stroke. It fired and kept firing, and this time the sound was different from any sound the shovelhead had made in the previous week of work and over the previous 3 days of its resurrection. It was different because the rings were seating correctly in the freshly honed bores, and the combustion was completing fully in both cylinders, and the idle that settled into place after 6 seconds of warm-up was not the rough, oscillating, fighting for its life idle of 3 weeks ago. It was steady, it was deep. It was even in the particular way of a well-tuned twin-cylinder air-cooled engine, not the metronomic evenness of a modern fuel-injected machine, but the organic breathing evenness of a mechanical system in correct alignment, each component doing its job without interfering with what was adjacent to it. Marcus held the throttle at idle. He listened. He listened for the tick. It was not there. The machined rocker arm had seated fully in the previous weeks. The contact pattern had established itself exactly as Walter had said it would, and the front cylinder's valve train was quiet. He listened for the blow-by roughness. It was not there. The new rings had sealed the bores and the engine's oil was staying clean and the top end was breathing correctly. He listened for anything Walter might hear that he couldn't. He looked at Walter. Walter was listening, head slightly tilted, eyes not quite focused on anything visible. The same posture Marcus had seen in the parking structure, in the shop during the first start, every time the old man was doing the thing that was at the center of everything he was. Walter listened for a long time. The engine ran. And then slowly, in the particular way of a face that doesn't perform emotion but can't entirely suppress it, something happened to Walter Boyd's expression. Something that had been held in careful neutrality throughout this entire job, throughout every assessment and every instruction and every honest delivery of difficult news began to release. Not dramatically, not in a way that another person would necessarily notice unless they had been watching his face for weeks and had learned to read its smallest movements. But Marcus had been watching, and Marcus saw it. It was satisfaction. Not pride. Walter Boyd wasn't a man who confused satisfaction with pride, who needed to own the outcome to feel it. It was the satisfaction of someone who has done a thing correctly, who has brought the full weight of what he knows to bear on a problem that deserved it and has watched the result justify the effort. Walter opened his eyes fully. He looked at Marcus. "Give it throttle," he said. Marcus rolled the throttle open. The engine climbed. It climbed with a smoothness and authority that the machine had not demonstrated before, not in any of the test runs, not in the parking structure, not in any moment since Darnell had first rolled it through the shop door. The RPM rose cleanly, the carburetor feeding correctly, both cylinders firing in their proper interval, the primary chain running without slap, the valve train silent, the whole mechanical system operating as it had been designed to operate when Raymond Cruz had ridden it new off the lot in 1977 and found that it ran so well he couldn't believe an engine could run that well. Marcus held it at a medium throttle, opening for 30 seconds. He listened. He felt the handlebar in his hands and felt the vibration of the engine through it, the particular vibration of a shovel head at speed, coarse and direct and alive, in a way that modern isolated engine mounts had designed out of most motorcycles, the vibration that riders of that era described as the engine talking to you through the machine. He rolled back to idle. The engine settled. He looked at Darnell. Darnell Cruz was standing near the bay door with his phone raised. He had recorded it. He hadn't planned to. You could see that in how he held the phone, slightly awkward, the spontaneous gesture of someone who understands in real time that a moment is occurring that should exist in some form beyond memory. Darnell lowered the phone. He looked at Marcus. "He's going to hear that," Darnell said. His voice was rough. "I'm going to play it for him tonight." Marcus nodded. "Tell him she's ready," Marcus said. "Tell him she's right, all the way right." Darnell nodded. He lowered his head for a moment. His shoulders moved. He was doing what he'd done in the parking structure, crying without asking anyone's permission for it, crying with the directness of a man who has stopped spending energy on concealment because the feeling is too large and too honest to make small. He lifted his head. "I'll tell him," Darnell said. The engine ran on. Walter left that afternoon. He packed his canvas bag with the same economy he'd brought to everything, the spec sheet back in its fold, the magnifying glass in its case, the few specialized tools he'd brought that the shop didn't have. He put his jacket on. He picked up his cane. Marcus walked him to his truck. They stood beside the F-150 for a moment in the late afternoon. The shop behind them, the ordinary sounds of the neighborhood going on around them, a world that had no knowledge of what had happened inside that building over the past month. "The ticking," Marcus said. Walter looked at him. "When we were at the hospital, after the engine fired, you heard something change in the engine sound." He paused. "You turned to look at me and you didn't say anything. And I held the throttle because I could see in your face that you didn't want me to cut it." Walter was quiet. "What was it?" Marcus said. Walter shifted his weight on the cane. He looked at the ground for a moment, then back at Marcus. "A pre-ignition event," he said. "Brief, single cycle." He paused. The timing was marginally advanced for the condition's ambient temperature, the short warm-up time, the fuel mixture at that load point. Under those specific conditions, the combustion in the front cylinder initiated slightly before TDC. "Could it have damaged the engine?" Marcus said. "If it had continued, yes. Sustained pre-ignition on an engine with worn rings and a compromised oil supply would have accelerated ring failure and could have damaged the piston crown." He paused, but it didn't continue. The engine corrected itself when you held the throttle steady. The mixture leaned slightly as the carburetor normalized and the pre-ignition condition resolved. "Did you know it would resolve?" Marcus said. Walter was quiet for a moment. "I believed it would," he said. "I believed it based on 45 years of experience with this engine type and this carburetor configuration and what I had heard in the seconds before it happened." He paused. "But believing something and knowing something are different things. I believed it. I didn't know it." Marcus took that in. "So when you gave me that nod," he said, "when you looked at me and nodded and said she's holding." "I meant it," Walter said. "She was holding. The event was over. The repair was intact. The engine was stable." He held Marcus's eyes. "I told you the truth." "I know you did," Marcus said. Walter looked at the shop. "You've got a good team," he said. "Terrence has real hands. Joey is going to be exceptional if he learns to trust what he knows and stop second-guessing it when the answer doesn't come from a screen. And Derek," he stopped. He looked at Marcus. "Derek has something I can't teach. He has the thing that comes from paying attention because you actually care what happens." He paused. "You can't teach that. Either a person has it or they don't." Marcus nodded. "Keep him close," Walter said. "In 20 years, he'll be the one teaching." He opened his truck door. He put the canvas bag on the seat. He got in the process, taking him a moment, the cane going in after him. He pulled the door shut. Marcus stepped back. Walter rolled down the window. Marcus? Yeah. Walter looked at him from the truck seat, the late afternoon light on his face, 68 years old, and everything that meant visible in him and not hidden. You did the right thing, Walter said, when you made that one more call instead of the other one. He paused. You knew what mattered and you acted on it. That's all any of us can do. He paused once more. That's the whole job. He rolled up the window. He drove away. Marcus stood and watched the F-150 until it turned at the corner and was gone. Raymond Cruz died on a Tuesday morning 11 days later. Darnell called Marcus at 7:42. His voice was quiet and controlled and carried the particular steadiness of someone who has been moving towards a thing for a long time and has finally arrived at it and found that arrival is not the same as being ready. He went peaceful, Darnell said, in his sleep. The night nurse said his vitals just eased off, like he was letting something go. Marcus sat down. He watched the video, Darnell said, the one I recorded at the shop. He watched it every day for the last week. The nurses said he'd ask for it by name. He'd say, put on Magdalena. A pause. They didn't know what it was at first. They thought it was music. Darnell made a small sound that was both grief and something adjacent to laughter, the specific sound of people who loved someone remembering them accurately. He'd watch it and close his eyes and just listen. Marcus pressed the back of his hand against his mouth. He left a note, Darnell said, for you, for all of you. His voice shifted slightly. He dictated it to the day nurse last week. She wrote it out for him. A pause. Can I read it to you? Yes, Marcus said. Darnell read it. Raymond Cruz had dictated it in the direct, unhurried way of a man who had decided exactly what he wanted to say and didn't need to surround it with anything that wasn't the thing itself. He said, I spent 47 years with that machine. She carried me through everything worth carrying. When I thought she was gone, these men brought her back. Not because they had to, because they understood what it meant. That is the rarest thing there is. I am grateful to my last day. Then he said, tell Walter Boyd that the next time I see someone struggling with a timing problem, I'll walk over and help. Marcus sat with that for a long moment. The shop was quiet around him. The shovel head was in the corner off the main floor waiting for Darnell to come for it. Its new tires, its rebuilt top end, its welded case and machined rocker arm and replacement, push rod and hand-cleaned carburetor, and non-standard advanced spring that was close enough to matter all of it intact, all of it correct, all of it. The result of 5 people refusing to accept that a thing was finished before it had done what it needed to do. Darnell, Marcus said, yeah. When you're ready, when some time has passed, I want you to think about riding it. Silence. I'm not a rider, Darnell said. I know, Marcus said. I'm not saying tomorrow. I'm not saying next month. He paused. I'm saying the bike is right. The miles your uncle said were in it, they're there, all of them. Another pause. He rode it to his first run. He rode it when his daughter was born. He rode it to his best friend's funeral. He rode it when his wife left. Marcus stopped. He thought about the man in the 1991 photograph, laughing at something outside the frame, with his hand on the tank in the way of someone touching something that belonged to him completely. Some machines are meant to keep going. Some stories aren't finished when the person who started them is gone. He paused. That's all I'm saying. Darnell was quiet for a long time. Then he said, okay. He said it the same way he'd said it in the parking structure when Marcus told him the bike had run not a word of agreement exactly, but a word of receiving, of taking something in and letting it settle before deciding what to do with it. Okay, Darnell said again quieter. Call me whenever you're ready, Marcus said. We'll be here. He hung up. He sat in his office for a while. He thought about Walter Boyd's father waving from the window. He thought about a man named Raymond Cruz sitting in a wheelchair on the 3rd level of a hospital parking structure with his eyes closed listening. He thought about Terrence's hands on a welding rod and Derek rolling a push rod on a workbench and Joey on the phone to Greensboro explaining what a 1977 shovelhead needed and why Eric needed it today. He thought about 5 men in a shop for 3 days turning the impossible into the merely very difficult and then turning the very difficult into something that ran. He thought about the 8 words that had started it. He just wants to hear it run one more time. He got up from his desk. He went out to the shop floor. He went to the shovel head and stood in front of it in the ordinary morning light of a Tuesday with the sounds of the shop around him and the smell of oil and metal and the particular warmth of a building that has been worked in by people who care about what they're doing. He put his hand on the tank. He held it there. And he understood not for the first time but more completely than any previous time that this was the whole of what the work was. Not the diagnostics, not the spec sheets, not the correct torque sequence for cast iron cases, or the difference between lacquer thinner and carburetor cleaner on a Vuitton seat. All of that was real and all of it mattered. But underneath it, before it, and after it, and running through the center of it was something simpler and harder and more durable than any of that. The understanding that some things are worth fighting for past the point where fighting makes sense. That some requests, the right ones, the ones that come from someone standing in the middle of a shop with a helmet they haven't touched in 15 years, saying 8 words in a voice that is trying to stay controlled, are not requests at all. They are a call, and you either answer it or you don't, and the answer you give in that moment is the truest thing about you. Marcus Webb had answered. Walter Boyd had answered. Terrence and Joey and Derek had answered. And because they had answered, Raymond Cruz had heard his machine run. He had closed his eyes in a hospital parking structure on a Tuesday evening and listened to 47 years of his life come back to him through iron and combustion and the sound of an engine that had been given back its voice by people who understood that some things, once they matter, matter all the way to the end. The shovelhead stood on its kickstand in the corner of the shop, patient and complete and ready, holding in its rebuilt engine and its welded case and its machined rocker arm everything that 5 men had given to it and everything that 1 man had given to it over 47 years of the road. It was not waiting to become something. It already was.